The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast harsh shadows across the polished floor as Dr. Marcus Brennan, CEO of Westridge Memorial Hospital, raised his hand to strike the new night shift nurse. His palm never connected. In less than 2 seconds, the most powerful man in Riverside Falls found himself face down on the cold linoleum, his arm twisted at an angle that made seasoned ER doctors wince. His voice, usually booming with authority, reduced to a strangled whimper. "Please, let go." The woman standing over him, her scrubs still perfectly pressed despite the chaos, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 23 witnesses stood frozen, their hearts hammering, as they realized that the reign of terror that had lasted 7 brutal years had just ended in the time it takes to draw a single breath. Before we continue, I invite you to follow this story to its stunning conclusion. If you enjoy what unfolds, please like this video and comment with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. The morning Claire Donovan walked through the employee entrance of Westridge Memorial Hospital, the autumn air carried the scent of rain and dying leaves. She wore navy scrubs, carried a modest lunch bag, and moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned long ago that rushing rarely improved outcomes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her face, free of makeup, revealed neither eagerness nor apprehension. She looked like 1,000 other nurses beginning 1,000 other shifts in 1,000 other hospitals across the country. She was nothing of the sort. The nursing supervisor, Patricia Huang, met her at the third-floor station with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Patricia had worked at Westridge for 19 years, and the weariness showed in the lines around her mouth, the way her shoulders curved slightly forward as if preparing for an inevitable blow. "You're early," Patricia said, checking her watch. "Shift doesn't start for another 20 minutes. "I like to get oriented before things get busy," Claire replied, setting her bag in an empty locker. "Old habit." Patricia's smile flickered. "You'll find we do things a bit differently here. The administration has particular expectations." I read the employee handbook thoroughly. The handbook doesn't cover everything. Patricia glanced down the hallway, then lowered her voice. "Dr. Brennan, our CEO, he runs a tight ship, very tight. He expects perfection, and he's not shy about correcting mistakes." Claire nodded slowly, her gray eyes steady on Patricia's face. "What kind of corrections are we talking about?" The question hung in the air. Patricia looked away, busying herself with a stack of patient charts. "Just do your job well, follow protocols exactly, and stay out of his sight when possible. That's the best advice I can give you." Down the corridor, a medication cart rattled. A phone rang at the desk, shrill and insistent. The hospital hummed with its morning routines, labs being drawn, breakfast trays distributed, the overnight patients being assessed by the day shift. It all seemed perfectly ordinary, the kind of controlled chaos that characterized every hospital Claire had ever worked in, except for the way the other nurses moved. She noticed it within her first hour. They walked quickly but quietly, minimizing conversation. When Dr. Brennan's name came up, and it came up often, voices dropped automatically. A resident mentioned needing the CEO's approval for a protocol change and immediately looked over his shoulder, as if the words themselves might summon unwanted attention. Claire's first patient was an elderly woman named Dorothy Castellano, admitted overnight with pneumonia. Dorothy's daughter, Maria, sat in the bedside chair, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. "They keep saying someone will explain her treatment plan," Maria said, her voice tight with frustration. "But every time I ask questions, the doctors rush away. I don't even know which antibiotics she's on or how long she'll need to stay." Claire pulled up a chair, ignoring the schedule that told her she had 6 other patients to assess before noon. She spent 15 minutes walking Maria through every medication, every vital sign parameter, every expected milestone of recovery. She explained what symptoms to watch for, what improvements to expect, and wrote down the name and extension of Dorothy's attending physician. "You're different from the others," Maria said quietly. "Most of them act scared." "Scared of what?" Maria hesitated. "I don't know exactly, but you can feel it in this place, like everyone's walking on eggshells." Claire said nothing, but she filed the observation away alongside a dozen others she'd already made. The way nurses clustered in groups, speaking in whispers. The residents who jumped when someone's pager went off. The complete absence of laughter in a profession that usually found humor as a survival mechanism. By mid-morning, she understood why. Dr. Marcus Brennan arrived on the third floor like a storm front, his presence announced by the sudden stiffening of every spine in the corridor. He was a tall man, athletically built despite his 58 years, with silver hair styled in a way that probably cost more than most nurses earned in a day. His white coat was pristine, monogrammed with his name and title in elegant script. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in any meaningful way. Two administrators trailed behind him, both carrying tablets and wearing expressions of careful neutrality. Claire watched from the nurses' station as Brennan stopped at random rooms, firing questions at the attending physicians, critiquing chart documentation, pointing out what he considered inefficiencies with sharp, cutting remarks. "This discharge paperwork is incomplete," he snapped at a young resident outside room 312. "Do you even know what you're doing, or did they just hand out medical degrees to anyone this year?" The resident, a woman who couldn't have been more than 28, flushed crimson. "I'll correct it immediately, Dr. Brennan. You'll correct it now, and you'll stay 2 hours past your shift to review proper documentation protocols. Maybe that will help you remember next time." He didn't wait for a response, already moving to the next room, the next victim. Claire kept her face neutral, continuing to input patient data into the computer, but her fingers had stopped moving. She was watching, assessing, cataloging everything she saw. Brennan reached the nurses' station, and the atmosphere became glacial. Patricia straightened, her hands clasped in front of her like a student awaiting judgment. The other nurses found sudden urgent tasks that required their immediate attention elsewhere. "Mrs. Chen in 308 is complaining about noise," Brennan said, his voice cold and clipped. "She's a hospital board member's mother. Why is she being disturbed?" Patricia swallowed. "I'll check immediately, Dr. Brennan. I wasn't aware." "You weren't aware because you're not doing your job. This floor sounds like a train station. I expect silence during patient rest hours. Is that too complicated a concept?" "No, sir. I'll address it right away." Brennan's eyes swept the station and landed on Claire. "Who are you?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Claire Donovan. I started today." "Did you receive training on our noise policies?" "I did. The handbook specifies keeping voices low during rest hours, using soft-soled shoes, and minimizing equipment noise when possible." Something flickered in Brennan's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she'd answered directly instead of stammering an apology. "Then make sure you follow those policies. I won't tolerate disruption to our patient's recovery." "Understood." He studied her for another moment, as if trying to determine whether her calm demeanor represented respect or insubordination, then turned and continued down the hall, his entourage scrambling to keep pace. Patricia exhaled slowly once he was out of earshot. "You handled that well," she murmured. "Better than most on their first day." Claire returned her attention to the computer. "He asked a question. I answered it." "Yes, well, many people find him intimidating." "I've worked with intimidating people before." Over the next 2 weeks, Claire settled into the rhythm of Westridge Memorial. She arrived early, stayed late when needed, and executed her duties with quiet precision. Her patient assessments were thorough, her documentation flawless, her medication administration error-free. She volunteered for the difficult cases, the combative dementia patients, the withdrawal cases, the ones who needed extra time and patience that the other nurses were too exhausted to provide. She also watched and listened, and slowly, the picture of Westridge Memorial came into focus like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Dr. Brennan didn't just run the hospital, he owned it, in every sense that mattered. He'd inherited the position from his father, who'd built Westridge from a small community clinic into a regional medical center. Under Marcus Brennan's leadership, the hospital had expanded further, adding wings, acquiring smaller practices, becoming a powerhouse in Riverside Falls healthcare. On paper, he reported to a board of directors. In practice, he'd carefully cultivated that board with his allies, his business partners, his golfing buddies. They rubber-stamped his decisions and looked the other way when questions arose. His authority over the staff was absolute and enforced through fear. Nurses who questioned protocols found their schedules changed to the worst shifts, Overnight weekends, holidays, consecutive 12s that violated labor guidelines but were technically legal if the employee agreed to them. Doctors who pushed back on administrative decisions discovered their departmental budgets cut, their research grants mysteriously unfunded, their contract renewals subject to unexpected review periods. And then there were the incidents that no one talked about directly, but everyone knew. The ER physician who'd reported Brennan for berating a patient's family and found himself named in a fabricated malpractice complaint that destroyed his reputation. The charge nurse who'd filed an HR complaint about verbal abuse and was fired 3 weeks later for documentation errors that investigations could never quite prove or disprove. The lab technician who witnessed Brennan shove a junior doctor and suddenly decided to relocate to another state, leaving no forwarding information. Human resources existed in name only. The director, Kenneth Voss, was Brennan's former college roommate. Complaints went into his office and disappeared like stones dropped in deep water. The few employees brave enough or desperate enough to push back found their concerns reframed as misunderstandings, their complaints rewritten as performance issues, their credibility quietly dismantled through carefully constructed narratives. Claire learned all of this through careful observation and the occasional unguarded moment when exhausted colleagues forgot to maintain their protective silence. She didn't probe, didn't ask leading questions, just offered a sympathetic ear and remembered everything she heard. "He grabbed my arm once," a nurse named Jennifer confided during a rare quiet moment in the break room. She pulled up her sleeve to show a faint scar. "Pulled me aside so hard I fell against a medication cart. I had a bruise for 3 weeks. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I thought about reporting it, but I'm a single mom. I can't afford to lose this job, and everyone knows what happens to people who challenge him." "Did anyone else see it?" Claire asked quietly. Jennifer laughed bitterly. 5 people saw it. Not one of them would admit it if asked. This was the kingdom Claire had entered, and she navigated it with the patience of someone playing a much longer game than anyone around her understood. The confrontation, when it came, started with something insignificant. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into Claire's tenure. The ER was moderately busy. A chest pain case, 2 motor vehicle accidents with minor injuries, a child with a possible fracture. Claire had been pulled downstairs to help with the overflow, a common practice when the 3rd floor was adequately staffed. One of the MVA patients was a man named Gregory Ashford, mid-40s, complaining of neck pain after a rear-end collision. Protocol required a cervical collar and imaging before clearance. The ER physician, Dr. Sarah Lynn, had ordered a CT scan, but radiology was backed up with a critical stroke case. "How long is the wait?" Ashford demanded, his voice rising. "I've been here for 2 hours already." "I understand your frustration," Claire said evenly, checking his vital signs for the 3rd time. "The stroke patient is taking priority because it's life-threatening. Your scan should be ready within the next 30 minutes. "This is ridiculous. I'm in pain and you people are making me wait." Your pain medication is managing your symptoms and your vital signs are stable. I know it's difficult, but I don't want to hear excuses. I want service. Do you know who I am?" Claire met his eyes calmly. "A patient who's receiving appropriate care based on medical priority. I'll check with radiology again in 15 minutes and give you an update." Ashford's face reddened. "Get me your supervisor, now." "I'll let Dr. Lynn know you'd like to speak with her." "Not the doctor, your manager, someone who can actually do something about this incompetence." Claire pressed the call button for the charge nurse, maintaining her professional composure while Ashford continued his tirade. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Gregory Ashford was the chief financial officer of Riverside Development Corporation, the largest commercial property developer in the region. He sat on 3 hospital foundation boards and had personally donated $500,000 to Westridge Memorial's new cardiac wing. He was also Marcus Brennan's tennis partner. 20 minutes later, Brennan exploded through the ER doors like a missile seeking a target. "Where is she?" His voice carried across the entire department, silencing conversations and stopping staff mid-stride. "Where's the nurse who's refusing to provide care to Mr. Ashford?" Claire was in the medication room preparing an antibiotic for another patient. She heard the commotion, heard the edge of panic in the charge nurse's voice trying to explain the situation, heard the sharp click of expensive shoes on linoleum growing louder. She stepped out of the med room just as Brennan rounded the corner. "You!" he snarled, pointing at her. "What the hell do you think you're doing, making one of our most important donors wait for basic imaging?" The ER had gone completely silent. Every eye turned toward them. Nurses, doctors, paramedics dropping off new patients, families in the waiting area who could see through the glass partition. Claire set down the medication carefully, turned to face Brennan, and kept her voice level. Mr. Ashford's imaging was appropriately prioritized based on medical need. Radiology is currently scanning a potential stroke victim, which takes precedence according to... I don't give a damn about protocols. Brennan's face had gone purple, veins standing out on his neck. When a VIP patient needs something, you make it happen. You pull strings, you expedite, you do whatever it takes. With respect, Dr. Brennan, medical priority isn't determined by donation status. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Brennan took a step closer. He was 6 inches taller than Claire, using his physical presence as a weapon the way he'd probably done 1,000 times before. "Are you questioning my judgment? I'm following established emergency department protocols. You're refusing to provide adequate care because you're too incompetent to manage a simple scheduling issue." Dr. Lynn appeared from the trauma bay, her face tight with stress. "Dr. Brennan, the delay isn't Claire's fault. Radiology is dealing with a code stroke and... I wasn't talking to you, Sarah." Brennan didn't even look at her. "I'm addressing the nurse who apparently thinks she runs this ER." Claire could feel the fear radiating from every person in the department. She understood the dynamic now, understood that Brennan was performing as much as he was genuinely angry. This was how he maintained control: public humiliation, demonstrations of absolute power, reminders that no one was safe from his wrath. She also understood something else, something the trembling staff around her didn't. She had no intention of playing by his rules. "Mr. Ashford is receiving appropriate care," she said, her voice still calm, still professional. "His vital signs are stable, his pain is managed, and his imaging will be completed as soon as radiology is available. That's not incompetence. That's proper emergency medicine." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "You're done here. Get out of my ER. I'm in the middle of patient care." "Not anymore. You're fired. Security will escort you out." The charge nurse made a small sound of distress. Dr. Lynn opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting between Brennan and Claire. No one moved to intervene. No one spoke up. The pattern had been established long ago. Cross Marcus Brennan, and you pay the price. Alone. Claire looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression made Brennan pause. It wasn't fear, it wasn't defiance exactly, it was assessment, the kind of cool evaluation a chess player makes before a decisive move. "I'll finish administering Mrs. Henderson's antibiotic," Claire said quietly. "Then I'll collect my belongings and leave. Patient safety doesn't stop because you're angry." She turned away from him, actually turned her back on him, and walked calmly to the medication room to retrieve the antibiotic she'd prepared. Behind her, she could hear Brennan's sharp intake of breath, the rustle of his coat as he moved. "How dare you!" Claire continued walking, pushed open the medication room door, and picked up the syringe. She checked the label one more time, a habit so ingrained that even this moment couldn't shake it, then walked past Brennan toward Mrs. Henderson's bay. His hand shot out and grabbed her upper arm. The ER seemed to contract, every person holding their breath. Claire stopped, looked down at the hand gripping her arm, then up at Brennan's face. His fingers were tight enough to leave marks, tight enough that his knuckles had gone white. "Let go," she said softly. "You don't walk away from me when I'm... Let go of my arm, now!" Something in her voice made Brennan's grip tighten instead of release. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her face. "You're going to regret ever setting foot in my hospital." The antibiotic in Claire's hand remained perfectly steady. Her heart rate hadn't increased. Her breathing stayed even. She looked Brennan in the eye and spoke with the kind of quiet certainty that could only come from absolute confidence. "Dr. Brennan, you have 3 seconds to release my arm before I file assault charges against you in front of 23 witnesses." "You're threatening me?" "I'm informing you of consequences." 3, 2. He let go, but the rage in his eyes had transformed into something colder, more dangerous. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I think I have a fairly clear picture." Claire adjusted her grip on the syringe, turned, and administered the antibiotic to Mrs. Henderson with hands that never shook, making small talk with the elderly woman about her grandchildren while the entire ER watched in stunned silence. When she finished, she documented the medication in the computer, signed out of the system, and walked to the staff lounge to collect her jacket and bag. Brennan had disappeared, but the administrators who'd been following him earlier appeared like sharks drawn to blood. "Ms. Donovan," the taller one said, his voice professionally sympathetic in a way that made Claire's skin crawl. "I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding. Dr. Brennan was under significant stress, and perhaps—" "There's no misunderstanding," Claire interrupted. "I was fired for following emergency department protocols. I'd like that termination in writing, please, along with documentation of the specific performance failures that justified immediate dismissal without warning." The administrator blinked. "That's not really necessary. We can just—" "It's absolutely necessary. I'll need official documentation for unemployment benefits and for my professional records. I assume HR can provide that within 72 hours as required by state labor law?" The two men exchanged glances. "Ms. Donovan, I think you're being hasty. Why don't you take a few days to cool down and we can discuss this rationally?" "I am being rational. I'm also being precise. I was terminated without cause in the middle of my shift while providing patient care. I'd like that documented officially with Dr. Brennan's signature stating exactly what I did to warrant immediate dismissal." She smiled pleasantly. "Unless, of course, there's some concern about putting those reasons in writing." The implications settled over the conversation like frost. If they documented the firing, they'd have to justify it. If they couldn't justify it, they'd be admitting wrongful termination. If they tried to smooth it over without documentation, they'd be tacitly acknowledging that Brennan had acted improperly. We'll be in touch," the shorter administrator said finally. "I'll expect to hear from HR by end of business tomorrow." Claire slung her bag over her shoulder. "Have a good evening, gentlemen." She walked out through the ambulance bay, past the security guard who looked confused about whether he was supposed to stop her, into the parking lot where her 12-year-old sedan sat under a flickering streetlight. Only when she was alone, door locked, did Claire allow herself a long, slow breath. Her hands, which had remained steady through everything, trembled slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. Then her phone buzzed, a text from a number she hadn't used in 3 years. "Heard you made contact. Status?" Claire stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a single word. "Confirm." She deleted the message thread, started her car, and drove home through streets slick with rain, past houses where normal people lived normal lives, where hospital CEOs didn't assault staff and get away with it, where the powerful didn't prey on those beneath them without consequence. But Claire Donovan had never lived in that world. She'd lived in places where the powerful operated with impunity, where speaking up meant disappearing, where justice was a luxury afforded only to those who could afford lawyers and media attention and the kind of connections that insulated you from retaliation. She'd also lived in a world where a different kind of justice existed, the kind that came from careful planning, meticulous documentation, and the patience to let powerful men destroy themselves with their own hubris. As she pulled into her apartment complex, her phone buzzed again. A different number this time, one she recognized from her first day. Patricia Huang. "Are you okay? I heard what happened. I'm so sorry. He had no right." Claire typed back. "I'm fine. Thank you for checking on me." "Everyone's talking about it. You're the first person who ever stood up to him like that. But Claire, he's dangerous. Please be careful." "I will be." "Thanks, Patricia." She meant it, but not in the way Patricia imagined. Claire wasn't worried about Brennan's revenge because she understood something the terrified staff of Westridge Memorial didn't. Marcus Brennan had just made a critical mistake. He'd grabbed her in front of witnesses. He'd fired her without cause. He'd let his rage override his self-preservation instinct, and in doing so, he'd given Claire exactly what she needed. She climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped into the small space she'd rented furnished under a name that wasn't quite her own. The apartment was temporary, like everything else in her carefully constructed life. The nursing credentials were real enough. She'd earned them honestly through night school and weekend clinicals while serving overseas. The work history was partially fabricated, with dates altered and supervisors who'd been coached on what to say if anyone called for references. Claire Donovan was real and not real at the same time, a carefully crafted identity designed for a single purpose. She opened her laptop, navigated to an encrypted folder, and added new files to a collection that had been growing for 3 weeks. Voice recordings from her phone, which had been recording during every shift, photographs of schedules showing labor violations, documented cases of patient care being overridden for non-medical reasons, a growing list of witnesses with contact information and brief notes about what each person had observed, and now, a detailed account of her own termination, including the names of every person present, the exact words spoken, the physical assault, the attempt by administrators to cover it up. She typed for 90 minutes, recording everything while it was fresh, cross-referencing details, building a timeline. When she finished, she uploaded everything to a secure cloud server, then deleted the local copies. Her regular phone buzzed with another message, this time from an unknown number. "You've been a bad girl? Enjoy unemployment." Claire stared at the text. Brennan or one of his proxies, trying to intimidate her. She didn't respond, just took a screenshot and added it to her files. The next morning, she received a call from Kenneth Voss in HR. "Ms. Donovan, I've reviewed your termination, and I believe there may have been a misunderstanding." His voice oozed false warmth. Dr. Brennan was dealing with a difficult patient situation, and tensions were high. "We'd like to offer you reinstatement with full back pay for the day you missed." "On what terms?" "Simply an acknowledgement that the incident was an unfortunate miscommunication. We'll expunge it from your record completely." "And what about Dr. Brennan grabbing my arm?" A pause. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "The physical assault witnessed by approximately 23 people in the ER." "Ms. Donovan, I think you may have misinterpreted a stressful situation. Dr. Brennan is a passionate advocate for patient care, and sometimes he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. I have photographs. Would you like me to email them to you, or should I send them directly to the state medical board?" Another longer pause. "Ms. Donovan, I hope you're not considering making false accusations against—" "They're not false, and they're not accusations. They're documented facts. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to email me an official reinstatement offer with a full apology and confirmation that no disciplinary action of any kind is on my record. You're going to do that within 2 hours. And then I'm going to consider whether I want to return to an environment where the CEO commits battery against staff members." "You're being very unreasonable." "I'm being very documented. 2 hours, Mr. Voss." She hung up before he could respond. The email arrived 90 minutes later, carefully worded to admit nothing while offering everything. Claire read it 3 times, forwarded it to her encrypted server, then sent a polite response accepting reinstatement beginning the following Monday. She didn't want the job back, not really, but she needed access. She needed to be inside Westridge Memorial when the next phase began. And she needed Marcus Brennan to believe he'd won, that she'd been cowed into compliance like everyone else. That weekend, Claire drove 3 hours north to a coffee shop in a town she'd never visited before. She ordered a latte, sat in a corner booth, and waited. The woman who slid into the seat across from her 15 minutes later wore civilian clothes, jeans, a sweater, glasses. But Claire recognized the bearing, the way her eyes scanned the room before settling, the economical movements that came from years of training. "Captain," Claire said quietly. "Not anymore. It's just Amanda now." Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Reeves, formerly of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, smiled faintly. "You look well. Nursing suits you. It's good cover. It's more than that. I read your performance reviews, the real ones, not the ones in your cover file. You're a genuinely excellent nurse." Claire shrugged. "The skills transfer. You still have the documentation I sent?" Amanda pulled out a tablet, navigated to a secure folder, and turned the screen toward Claire. "Everything you've collected, plus additional background we've compiled independently. Brennan's worse than you thought. We've got 3 other hospitals where similar patterns emerge going back 12 years. Assault allegations that disappeared, financial irregularities that got buried. At least 2 suspicious deaths that might be medical malpractice but were never properly investigated. Is it enough? For what we need, almost. The problem is that Brennan has insulated himself brilliantly. Everything funnels through intermediaries. The board protects him. HR destroys evidence. Witnesses are terrified. We need something incontrovertible, something that even his connections can't sweep away. Claire nodded slowly. He's escalating. The grab in the ER was sloppy for him. He's feeling pressure from somewhere. He is. The state is conducting a routine hospital inspection next month. Nothing targeted at him specifically, but these inspections sometimes turn up problems. He's paranoid about it. Amanda leaned forward. Claire, if he suspects you're anything other than what you appear to be, this gets dangerous very quickly. Are you sure you want to continue? I spent 8 years watching powerful people destroy lives in places where no one could stop them, Claire said quietly. I'm not watching it happen here. Amanda studied her for a long moment. The offer still stands. You could come back, full reinstatement, no questions asked about the time you've been gone. You've more than earned it. After this is finished. All right. Amanda closed the tablet. Then let's talk about what happens when Brennan makes his next mistake. And trust me, he will. They talked for 2 hours, going over scenarios, discussing legal strategies, reviewing the evidence chain. When they finished, Amanda paid for both coffees and stood to leave. Claire, whatever happens, you don't have to do this alone. You've got a whole team supporting you now. Lawyers, investigators, people who've been trying to nail Brennan for years. Use them. Claire nodded, but they both knew the truth. When the critical moment came, she would be alone in a room with Marcus Brennan, and everything would depend on what happened in those few seconds. On Monday morning, Claire returned to Westridge Memorial. The response from her colleagues was immediate and complicated. Some avoided her entirely, as if her defiance of Brennan was contagious. Others sought her out in quiet moments, whispering words of support they'd never dare speak openly. Patricia hugged her briefly in the break room, her eyes shining with tears. I thought you were gone for good, Patricia said. Well, I'm glad you're back. Me too. But the atmosphere had changed. Brennan had made his position clear, and now everyone waited to see what would happen next. Would Claire be quietly reassigned to the worst shifts until she quit? Would mysterious performance issues suddenly appear in her file? Would she simply disappear like others who'd challenged the CEO? Claire worked her shifts with the same quiet competence as before, but now she noticed the additional scrutiny. Administrators appeared more frequently on her floor. Her documentation was checked and rechecked. Kenneth Voss personally reviewed her patient assignments. They were building a case, collecting ammunition, waiting for her to make a mistake they could use against her. She made sure to give them nothing. And then, 3 weeks after her return, everything accelerated. It started with a patient named Robert Chen, 72 years old, admitted for shortness of breath. His initial workup suggested heart failure, but something about his presentation bothered Claire. The symptoms didn't quite fit. His lung sounds were clear. His oxygen saturation was better than his respiratory rate suggested it should be. She mentioned her concerns to the attending physician, Dr. James Morrison. He listened, nodded, and told her he'd consider additional testing. An hour later, Dr. Brennan appeared on the floor. I understand you're questioning Dr. Morrison's diagnosis, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Claire looked up from the medication she was preparing. I shared an observation about Mr. Chen's presentation. Dr. Morrison is the attending. The diagnostic decisions are his. Your job is to follow orders, not to play doctor. My job is to advocate for patient safety. If something doesn't seem right, nothing is not right, except your attitude. Brennan stepped closer, using his physical presence the same way he had in the ER. You seem to think your nursing degree makes you qualified to override physicians with decades more training. It doesn't. Other nurses had stopped working, listening despite themselves. This was the pattern: public humiliation, the reassertion of control, the reminder that no one was safe. Claire met his eyes steadily. I shared a clinical observation with the attending. That's within my scope of practice. Your scope of practice is what I say it is. The words hung there, naked in their arrogance. Brennan seemed to realize he'd gone too far, exposed too much. He turned abruptly and left, leaving Claire standing there with a syringe in her hand and 24 witnesses who'd just heard the CEO of their hospital admit that he considered himself above professional standards. She carefully set down the medication and walked to the nurse's station computer. Her hands moved quickly across the keyboard, documenting the conversation in exact detail, time-stamped and saved to the medical record as a clinical note. Patricia appeared at her elbow. "Claire, what are you doing? If he sees that note, then he'll see it." Claire finished typing and logged out. "Patient advocacy is my job, Patricia. I'm not going to stop doing it because he's angry." That night, Claire's phone exploded with messages. Most were from burner numbers or encrypted apps, colleagues too frightened to use their real names but desperate to share their own stories. One was from Dr. Morrison. "You were right about Chen. Ran additional tests. Pulmonary embolism, not CHF. Good catch, but watch your back." She saved the message, added it to her files, and tried to sleep. The explosion came 2 days later on a Friday night when the hospital was transitioning from day shift to night, when staffing was thinnest and tensions highest. Claire was helping with a transfer patient, a young woman named Kelly Martinez, who'd been in a severe car accident. Kelly was stable, but in significant pain, her pelvis fractured in 3 places. The ER physician had ordered appropriate pain medication, but the pharmacy was behind, and the medication hadn't arrived yet. Kelly was crying, her mother holding her hand and begging for help. Claire had paged pharmacy twice, called the physician to see if alternative pain management was possible, and was preparing to call the nursing supervisor when Dr. Brennan appeared. He wasn't supposed to be there. His normal schedule had him leaving by 6 p.m. on Fridays. But here he was, standing in the doorway of Kelly's room, his expression thunderous. "Why is this patient screaming?" he demanded. "She's in pain from her injuries," Claire said evenly. "Her medication was delayed, but I'm working with the physician to—" "Then work faster. I can hear her from my office." Kelly's mother stared at Brennan. "Are you seriously complaining about noise while my daughter is suffering?" Brennan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond to her. Instead, he grabbed Claire's arm, again, and pulled her into the hallway. "You're incompetent," he hissed. "You can't manage a basic pain control issue without creating a disturbance that disrupts the entire—" Claire jerked her arm free. "Don't touch me. I'll do whatever I want in my hospital." "No," Claire said quietly. "You won't." And in that moment, something shifted in Brennan's eyes. Maybe he saw something in her face that finally penetrated his arrogance. Maybe he realized, too late, that he'd been operating on the assumption that everyone in his orbit was controllable, and that Claire had never fit that pattern. Maybe he simply snapped under the accumulated pressure of a life built on bullying and intimidation. His hand rose, palm open, aimed at her face. The slap never landed. What happened next took 1.8 seconds, though to the witnesses frozen in shock, it seemed to unfold in slow motion. Claire's left hand came up and redirected Brennan's arm, her fingers finding the pressure points at his wrist with surgical precision. Her right hand moved to his elbow, applying controlled force to the joint. She turned her body, using his momentum and her leverage to guide him down and forward in a textbook joint lock that any military police officer would recognize immediately. Dr. Marcus Brennan, CEO of Westridge Memorial Hospital, found himself face down on the corridor floor, his arm extended at an angle that caused pain without causing injury, completely immobilized by the small, quiet nurse he'd tried to hit. "Let go," he gasped. "Let go of me right now." "Security is on the way," Claire said, her voice perfectly calm. "I'm going to release you when they arrive. Until then, you're going to stay exactly where you are and think very carefully about the choice you just made." Around them, the world had stopped. Nurses stood frozen in doorways. A physician's pen had actually fallen from her hand, clattering on the tile. Kelly's mother stood in the patient room doorway, her mouth open in shock. Someone had the presence of mind to hit the emergency button. Alarms sounded, bringing security at a run. They rounded the corner and stopped dead, trying to process the scene in front of them. "She attacked me!" Brennan shouted, his voice high and panicked in a way none of them had ever heard before. "She assaulted me! Get her off me!" Claire looked at the security guards calmly. "Dr. Brennan attempted to strike me. Multiple witnesses saw it. I restrained him using minimal necessary force to prevent the assault. I'll release him as soon as you're ready to take him into custody." Into custody? The senior guard, a man named Michael Torres, who'd worked at Westridge for 15 years, looked completely lost. "Ms. Donovan, I don't think—" "He tried to hit her," Kelly's mother said loudly. "I saw the whole thing. He grabbed her, and when she pulled away, he tried to slap her across the face. She just defended herself. Other voices chimed in, witnesses suddenly finding their courage in the presence of Brennan's absolute humiliation. I saw it too. He grabbed her arm first. She didn't do anything wrong. She just stopped him from hitting her. Brennan's face had gone from purple to white. You're all lying. I was just... She's the one who... Sir, Michael Torres said carefully, I'm going to need you to calm down. Ms. Donovan, can you release him, please? Claire looked at Michael, then at the growing crowd of witnesses, then at the security cameras mounted in the corners of the corridor that had captured every moment of the encounter. She released the pressure on Brennan's arm and stepped back, her hands at her sides, non-threatening. Brennan scrambled to his feet, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his pristine white coat twisted and marked with floor dust. For the first time in 7 years, every person in Westridge Memorial Hospital saw their CEO as something other than invincible. They saw him afraid. She's fired, Brennan shouted, pointing at Claire with a shaking finger. I want her arrested for assault. I want her prosecuted. You want to be very careful about what you say next, a new voice interrupted. Dr. Sarah Lynn had appeared from the ER, and she held her phone up, recording. Because all of us saw what happened, and it's not going to match whatever story you're about to tell. Brennan stared at her, then at Claire, then at the circle of witnesses who'd somehow found the courage to stop looking away. The kingdom he'd built through fear and intimidation cracked visibly, fractures spreading through the foundation he'd thought unshakable. My office, he managed finally. Now. All supervisors, my office in 10 minutes. He turned and walked away, trying to salvage some dignity from the worst 90 seconds of his professional life, leaving Claire standing in the corridor surrounded by colleagues who looked at her with a mixture of awe and terror. Patricia was crying silently, her hands over her mouth. Dr. Lynn slowly lowered her phone. Michael Torres cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Donovan, I'll need to file an incident report about this. Of course, Claire said. I'll provide a complete statement. I'd also like to file assault charges against Dr. Brennan for attempting to strike me and for grabbing my arm earlier in the interaction. I'm not sure there are at least 15 witnesses. The cameras captured it. It's assault and battery, Michael. Whether or not you're comfortable acknowledging it doesn't change what happened. He nodded slowly. I'll document everything. Claire looked around at the faces watching her. If any of you saw what happened and you're willing to provide a statement, please talk to security. I know it's frightening. I know there could be consequences. But this stops now, tonight, or it never stops at all. She turned and walked back to Kelly's room. The pain medication had finally arrived during the chaos, and Claire administered it with steady hands, made small talk with Kelly and her mother, and documented everything in the chart as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. But outside the room, the whispers were spreading through Westridge Memorial like wildfire. The nurses on the 3rd floor called the nurses on the 2nd floor. The ER staff texted the OR staff. Within an hour, everyone in the hospital knew that someone had finally stood up to Marcus Brennan, and more importantly, they knew he'd lost. In his office, Brennan was making frantic phone calls to the hospital board chairman, to his personal attorney, to Kenneth Voss in HR, to anyone who might contain the damage, spin the narrative, protect him the way they always had. But Claire Donovan wasn't like the others. She hadn't backed down. She hadn't accepted a payoff. She hadn't disappeared quietly into the night. And now there were witnesses, dozens of them, and video evidence, and a paper trail of complaints that HR had tried to bury but which Claire had meticulously documented and preserved. In a small apartment across town, Claire sat at her laptop and uploaded the night's incident report to her encrypted files. Then she sent a single encrypted message to Amanda Reeves. Phase complete. He took the bait. Ready to proceed. The response came back within minutes. Team assembling, documentation verified. Go forward with extreme caution. This is when he's most dangerous. Claire closed her laptop and looked at her reflection in the dark window. She could still feel the echo of the joint lock, the familiar muscle memory from training exercises she'd performed thousands of times in another life. Could still hear Brennan's voice, high with panic, stripped of its usual authority. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Marcus Brennan had no idea what was about to hit him, but somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that wasn't consumed with rage and fear, he was beginning to suspect that the quiet nurse with the calm gray eyes had never been what she appeared to be at all. And he was absolutely right. The dawn came cold and gray over Riverside Falls, and with it, the machinery of retribution began to turn. Claire arrived at Westridge Memorial at 6:15 Saturday morning, 45 minutes before her scheduled shift. The hospital had a different energy on weekends, quieter corridors, skeleton administrative staff, a sense that the usual hierarchies relaxed slightly when the executives weren't prowling the floors. But this Saturday was different. She could feel the tension the moment she stepped through the employee entrance, could see it in the way the overnight staff clustered in tight groups, speaking in urgent whispers that died the instant she appeared. News traveled fast in hospitals. Everyone knew what had happened the night before. Everyone had an opinion, a theory, a prediction about what would happen next. The break room fell silent when Claire walked in to store her lunch. A dozen pairs of eyes, tracking her movements as if she might spontaneously combust or transform into something else entirely. She ignored them, prepared her coffee with the same unhurried movements as always, and checked her patient assignment on the board. 6 patients on the cardiac step-down unit, all stable, all requiring the kind of attentive but routine care that made up the bulk of hospital nursing. Patricia had scheduled her for the quietest section of the floor, probably trying to keep her out of trouble, away from any possible confrontation with administration. It wouldn't matter. The confrontation was coming whether Patricia tried to prevent it or not. Claire? Jennifer appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. Can we talk? Privately? They stepped into the medication room, the only space that offered any semblance of privacy. Jennifer twisted her hands together, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I gave a statement to security last night about what I saw, about him trying to hit you. The words came out in a rush, as if she needed to say them before her courage failed. I also told them about the time he grabbed my arm, and about 2 other incidents I witnessed but never reported. Claire felt something shift in her chest, a weight she'd been carrying without fully acknowledging it. Jennifer, that took incredible courage. I'm terrified. Jennifer's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I have 2 kids. I can't lose this job, but I can't keep watching him hurt people either. After last night, after seeing you actually stand up to him and survive it, I thought maybe if enough of us speak up, they'll have to do something. They will. Claire kept her voice steady, certain. But Jennifer, I need you to understand something. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Brennan will fight back. He'll try to discredit witnesses, create alternate narratives, use every resource he has to protect himself. Are you prepared for that? Jennifer nodded, though her hands trembled. Dr. Lynn said she's willing to testify too. And Marcus from security, Michael's brother, said he's been keeping a personal file of incidents for 3 years, things he witnessed but couldn't officially report because HR would bury them. He wants to turn it over to whoever's investigating. The dam was breaking. 7 years of accumulated rage and fear and suppressed testimony, all flooding out now that someone had finally punched a hole in Brennan's armor of invincibility. Tell everyone who wants to make a statement to document everything in writing, with dates and details, and keep copies somewhere safe, not at work, not on hospital computers. And Jennifer, thank you. The shift proceeded with deceptive normalcy. Claire assessed her patients, administered medications, updated care plans, and charted everything with meticulous precision. But beneath the surface, the hospital was transforming. Small acts of rebellion appeared everywhere, like flowers pushing through concrete. A resident who'd always scurried away when Brennan approached now walked past his office with his head high. A lab technician filed a formal complaint about verbal abuse from 2 years ago. The nurses on the oncology unit drafted a letter detailing unsafe staffing conditions they'd been forced to work under and sent it directly to the state health department, bypassing HR entirely. Word spread that an emergency board meeting had been called for Monday morning. Kenneth Voss appeared on multiple floors, his usually smug expression replaced with barely concealed panic, trying to convince witnesses to reconsider their statements, offering vague promises of resolution if people would just be reasonable about the situation. No one was feeling reasonable anymore. At noon, Claire's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Parking garage, level 3. Now. She recognized the coding. Amanda Reeves, using standard operational security protocols. Claire told Patricia she was taking her lunch break, rode the elevator down to the underground garage, and found Amanda's rental car parked in a far corner away from the security cameras. "Get in," Amanda said through the cracked window. Claire slid into the passenger seat. Amanda handed her a thick folder without preamble. Federal investigation officially opened as of 9 a.m. this morning. FBI, Department of Health and Human Services, and the State Attorney General's office. They're coming at him from 3 directions: Medicare fraud, healthcare provider abuse, and potential RICO violations if we can establish a pattern of criminal enterprise. Claire paged through the documents, her trained eye catching the highlights. Financial records showing millions in inflated billing, patient care records altered to justify unnecessary procedures, a network of kickbacks with medical device manufacturers and pharmaceutical reps, and buried in the middle, a section titled Pattern of Intimidation and Assault that made her stomach turn. "How many victims?" she asked quietly. "That we've confirmed? 47 employees over 12 years across 4 different hospitals. That's just the ones willing to talk. The real number is probably double that." Amanda's jaw was tight. "He's been doing this his entire career, Claire. His father taught him well: build an empire, install loyalists in every position that matters, and crush anyone who threatens the structure. The old man faced 3 separate investigations during his tenure and walked away from all of them clean. But Marcus isn't as smart as his father. He got sloppy, especially in the last 2 years, left digital trails, sent emails that amount to written confessions, made threats in front of witnesses who weren't as terrified as he assumed." Amanda pulled out a tablet, navigated to a video file. "This came in this morning, security footage from 6 weeks ago. The video showed Brennan in his office with a young surgical resident. The audio was muffled but clear enough. Brennan's voice, cold and measured. 'You can file your complaint, Dr. Ramirez. You absolutely have that right. But understand that your contract comes up for renewal in 4 months, and I've already had conversations with the chiefs of surgery at every hospital within 200 miles. Your career in this region is over the moment you walk out that door with paperwork in your hand. Your choice.' The resident, a woman who couldn't have been more than 30, left the office empty-handed, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Claire felt rage crystallize in her chest, cold and focused. Where is Dr. Ramirez now? Working at a rural clinic in Montana. Took a massive pay cut, left her family behind, all to get away from him. But when she heard about your incident last night, she called us. Said she's ready to testify." Amanda closed the tablet. "That's happening all over. People he broke are finding their voices again, but Claire, we need to talk about your safety." "I'm fine." "You humiliated him in front of dozens of witnesses. Men like Brennan don't respond to humiliation with rational thought. They respond with escalation. He's going to come after you with everything he has, and some of those things might not be legal or ethical." Claire met her eyes steadily. "Then he'll make more mistakes, and we'll document every single one." Amanda studied her for a long moment. "You know, when I first recruited you for this, I thought you were doing it for the mission. Justice, accountability, all the righteous reasons we tell ourselves. But it's more than that for you, isn't it? I spent 8 years in places where people with power destroyed anyone beneath them because they could. Where girls disappeared and no one investigated. Where men beat their wives and the military police looked the other way because the perpetrator was too valuable to lose. Where commanders ignored assault reports because processing them would hurt readiness statistics." Claire's voice remained level, but something burned beneath the surface. "I'm done watching that happen." "Good." Amanda started the car's engine. "Because Brennan's legal team is already spinning a narrative. Self-defense against an aggressive employee. Questions about your background, your credentials, suggestions that you might have prior history of violence. They're going to dig into every corner of your life. Let them dig. The credentials are solid and the background will hold up to scrutiny." Claire opened the car door. "What about the board meeting Monday?" "Officially, it's to discuss recent incidents affecting hospital operations. Unofficially, 3 board members have already called for Brennan's immediate suspension pending investigation. The others are circling wagons, but the federal interest changes everything. The hospital's Medicare funding is at risk if they're found to have enabled his behavior. That's more important to them than loyalty. Claire stepped out of the car, then leaned back in. Amanda, thank you for believing this was worth pursuing. Thank you for having the guts to be the catalyst. Most people would have walked away. Most people haven't seen what I've seen. Back on the cardiac unit, the afternoon brought a new complication. One of Claire's patients, a 68-year-old man named Edward Frost, began showing signs of decreased cardiac output, rising heart rate, dropping blood pressure, diminished urine output. Claire caught it early, recognizing the subtle pattern before it became critical. She notified the attending physician, Dr. David Marsh, who ordered additional monitoring and medication adjustments. But when Claire went to implement the orders, she found them blocked in the computer system. A message appeared on her screen. Prescriber authorization suspended pending administrative review. She stared at the words, feeling the trap close around her. They were blocking Dr. Marsh's orders, using Edward Frost as a weapon, betting that Claire would either ignore the block and give medications anyway, which would be grounds for immediate termination and loss of license, or follow the rules and let a patient deteriorate while bureaucracy played out. Claire picked up the phone and called the nursing supervisor. This is Claire Donovan on cardiac step-down. I have a patient showing signs of decreased cardiac output, physician orders in the system, but the orders are blocked due to prescriber authorization issues. I need this resolved immediately. The supervisor's voice was strained. I'll look into it. This is time-sensitive. Mr. Frost needs intervention now, not after an administrative review. I understand, but I can't override the system block without authorization from Then get that authorization. I'll give you 10 minutes, and then I'm calling the chief medical officer directly and documenting that patient care is being obstructed for non-medical reasons. She hung up before the supervisor could respond. Patricia appeared at her elbow, her face tight with concern. Claire, what are you doing? If you escalate this, if you go over people's heads... A patient is becoming unstable, and someone blocked his treatment orders to punish me. I'm not playing political games while Mr. Frost's heart fails. Claire pulled out her personal phone and began documenting everything. Screenshots of the blocked orders, time-stamped photos of the patient's monitor showing his deteriorating vital signs, a detailed written account of her attempts to get the block removed. 7 minutes later, the orders cleared. Claire administered the medications, watched Edward Frost's vital signs stabilize, and charted the entire incident in exhaustive detail, including the unexplained delay in treatment. Dr. Marsh found her an hour later. What the hell happened with Frost's orders? I got a call from administration demanding to know why I was making inappropriate prescribing decisions. Claire showed him her documentation. His face darkened as he read. They blocked my orders? My valid, medically necessary orders for a deteriorating patient? He looked up, his eyes blazing. That's not just inappropriate, that's potentially criminal. Patient care decisions aren't subject to administrative veto. Well, unless the administration is trying to create a situation where I either violate protocols or neglect a patient, either way they get ammunition to terminate me. Dr. Marsh's hand tightened on his phone. I'm calling the chief medical officer right now. This crosses every line we have. The incident rippled through the medical staff like an earthquake. Physicians who'd kept their heads down, who'd rationalized that Brennan's abuses were administrative issues that didn't concern them, suddenly realized that the toxic leadership had metastasized to the point where it threatened clinical care. By the end of Claire's shift, a petition was circulating among the doctors demanding an independent investigation and Brennan's immediate removal from any role involving patient care oversight. Claire drove home through evening traffic, watching her rear-view mirror out of habit, noting the silver sedan that stayed 3 cars back for longer than coincidence would explain. She took a random series of turns, watched the sedan follow, then pulled into a busy shopping center parking lot and walked into a grocery store through one entrance and out another. The sedan was gone when she returned to her car, but the message was clear. Brennan or his proxies were watching her, following her, trying to intimidate or gather information or both. She sent Amanda a quick text. Surveillance confirmed. Silver sedan, plate partial 7KT. The response came quickly. Registered to private investigation firm retained by Brennan's attorney. Legal but aggressive. Vary routes. Check your apartment for entry. Assume all communications monitored except encrypted channels. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to every creak and footstep in the building, her mind running through scenarios and contingencies. The attacks would intensify now. Brennan was cornered, and cornered animals were most dangerous. He'd try to destroy her credibility, her career, possibly her safety. The playbook was predictable. Paint her as unstable, vengeful, a problem employee who'd manipulated the situation. Find anything in her past that could be twisted, any vulnerability that could be exploited. The problem for Brennan was that Claire's past was very carefully constructed, and the parts that weren't constructed were sealed under layers of military classification and national security protocols that his lawyers couldn't penetrate. Sunday morning brought a new development. Claire woke to 17 missed calls from colleagues, 5 voicemails, and a flood of text messages. She played the first voicemail, from Patricia, her voice shaking. "Claire, I don't know if you've seen it yet, but there's a letter circulating. Brennan's attorney sent it to the entire hospital staff. It's saying terrible things about you. I know they're lies, but people are talking. Call me when you get this." Claire opened her laptop and found the letter in her work email, copied to every employee at Westridge Memorial. It was a masterpiece of legal slander, carefully worded to avoid actionable defamation while destroying her reputation. Phrases like "concerning background discrepancies" and questions about credential authenticity and prior incidents of aggressive behavior littered the text. It suggested, without quite stating, that Claire had falsified her nursing credentials, that she had a history of violence, that the incident with Brennan was a calculated setup by someone with ulterior motives. The letter concluded with an offer. If Claire resigned immediately and signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, the hospital would not pursue criminal charges for assault or credential fraud and would provide a neutral employment reference. It was a trap disguised as mercy. If she resigned and signed the NDA, Brennan walked away clean. If she fought back, she faced the full weight of his legal resources and the very real possibility that mud would stick, even if the accusations were baseless. Claire read the letter 3 times, feeling a cold smile cross her face. Brennan had just made his 3rd critical mistake. The first was grabbing her in the ER. The second was trying to hit her in front of witnesses. And now this, written defamation distributed to hundreds of people, creating a documented trail of retaliatory harassment that any competent attorney could tear apart. She forwarded the letter to Amanda, then called her directly on an encrypted line. "Did you see it?" Claire asked. "Just reading it now. He's panicking. This is sloppy, actionable, and proves our case about his pattern of retaliation." Amanda's voice carried grim satisfaction. "His attorneys are either incompetent or he's ignoring their advice and making decisions emotionally. Either way, it helps us." "What about the credential questions? Will that gain traction?" "Your nursing license is completely legitimate, issued by the state board, verifiable through official channels. The rest of your background is sealed tight enough that his investigators will hit walls they can't climb. They might find some gaps in your employment history, but gaps aren't crimes." Amanda paused. "Claire, this letter gives you grounds for a defamation suit. Combined with the assault, the wrongful termination attempt, and the obstruction of patient care, you could personally bankrupt him." "I don't want his money." "I know, but the threat of a suit will keep him reactive instead of strategic. Let me connect you with our legal team. They'll draft a response that puts him on defense." By Sunday evening, Claire had spoken with 3 different attorneys, all of whom assured her that Brennan had just handed them a gift. They drafted a letter of their own, addressed to Brennan, the hospital board, and Westridge Memorial's general counsel. It was a surgical demolition of Brennan's accusations, backed by verified documentation of Claire's credentials, a detailed timeline of Brennan's retaliatory actions, and a promise of legal action if the defamatory statements weren't retracted within 24 hours. The letter also included a new element: a list of 47 former Westridge Memorial employees willing to testify about Brennan's pattern of abuse, assault, and retaliation. Names, dates, incidents, all documented and verified. The message was clear. Claire wasn't alone. And the case against Brennan was far larger than one night in a hospital corridor. Monday morning arrived with the weight of a guillotine blade poised to drop. Claire dressed carefully, professional but not corporate, confident but not aggressive. She arrived at the hospital 2 hours before her shift, walked past the security desk where Michael Torres gave her a subtle nod, and made her way to the administrative wing where the board meeting was scheduled. She wasn't invited to attend. She didn't care. She sat in the waiting area outside the boardroom, visible through the glass walls, a silent reminder that the person they were discussing was real and present and not going to disappear quietly. The board members arrived in clusters, some avoiding her eyes, others offering tight, uncomfortable smiles. Kenneth Voss appeared, saw her sitting there, and went pale. He ducked into a side office, his phone already pressed to his ear. At precisely 8 a.m., the boardroom doors closed. Claire couldn't hear what was being said, but she could read body language through the glass. The hospital board chairman, a retired banker named Gerald Crawford, led the meeting with visible discomfort. Brennan sat at one end of the table, flanked by two attorneys, his posture rigid with barely contained rage. The meeting lasted 93 minutes. Claire watched as documents were passed around, as voices rose and fell, as one board member, a woman Claire didn't recognize, stood up and pointed at Brennan, her face flushed with anger. She watched as Brennan's attorneys whispered urgently to him, their hands making calming gestures that he ignored. When the doors finally opened, Gerald Crawford emerged first, looking 20 years older than when he'd entered. He spotted Claire and paused, seeming to wrestle with what to say. "Ms. Donovan, the board has decided to place Dr. Brennan on immediate administrative leave pending a comprehensive investigation of recent allegations." His voice was formal, carefully neutral. "You'll be contacted by our investigators to provide a full statement. In the meantime, you're to continue your normal duties without interference." "Who's conducting the investigation?" Claire asked. "An independent firm retained by the board, as well as cooperating with federal investigators who have expressed interest in the matter." He glanced back at the boardroom. "I want you to know that this board takes these allegations extremely seriously. If the investigation confirms what's been alleged, there will be significant consequences." Claire stood. "Mr. Crawford, with respect, there have been significant allegations for 7 years. Why is the board only taking them seriously now?" The question hung in the air. Crawford's face tightened, but before he could respond, Brennan exploded from the boardroom. "This is a witch hunt." His voice carried down the corridor, drawing startled looks from administrators and staff. "A coordinated attack by a disgruntled employee with a grudge and a history of—" "Dr. Brennan?" One of his attorneys interrupted urgently. "We should discuss this privately." "Privately? Everyone in this hospital is talking about it. Everyone has already decided I'm guilty." He turned his fury on Claire. "You planned this. From the moment you walked into my hospital, you planned to destroy me." Claire met his gaze calmly. "I planned to do my job. You're the one who couldn't handle a nurse following patient care protocols without resorting to assault." "I never assaulted you. I was trying to correct your incompetence, and you attacked me." 23 witnesses say otherwise, so does security footage." Brennan took a step toward her, and both attorneys grabbed his arms, physically restraining him. "You have no idea what you've started," he hissed. "I will bury you. I will destroy everything you—" "Dr. Brennan!" Gerald Crawford's voice cracked like a whip. "You are on administrative leave effective immediately. You need to leave the premises now." "You can't force me out of my own hospital." "Security," Crawford said quietly, and Michael Torres appeared from around the corner with 2 other guards, their presence making the situation brutally clear. Brennan stared at the security team, at the board members watching from the doorway, at Claire standing silent and unmoved. Something in his expression shifted, the rage giving way to a terrible understanding that his kingdom was crumbling in real time and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "This isn't over," he said, his voice dropping to something cold and deadly. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what I'm capable of." He turned and walked toward the exit, his attorneys trailing behind, leaving a wake of stunned silence. Claire watched him go, feeling the collective exhale of everyone in the corridor, the sense that something fundamental had shifted in the hospital's DNA. Patricia found her minutes later, tears streaming down her face. "It's really happening. He's actually gone." "For now," Claire said quietly. "The investigation still has to run its course." "Do you think they'll really hold him accountable? Or will they find a way to bring him back once things quiet down?" It was the question everyone was asking, the fear that this was temporary, that powerful men always found ways to escape consequences, that the moment the spotlight moved, Brennan would return, and everyone who'd spoken up would pay the price. Claire thought about the federal investigation, about the 47 documented victims, about the financial crimes and the Medicare fraud and the mountain of evidence that had been building for years waiting for someone to finally crack the facade. "They won't bring him back," she said. "Not this time." The rest of Monday passed in a blur of interviews. Federal investigators, state health inspectors, the independent firm hired by the board, all of them wanted Claire's statement, wanted to hear about the assault, about the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed, about every detail of her 3 weeks at Westridge Memorial. She told them everything, supported by documentation so thorough that the lead FBI agent actually laughed and said, "You document like a federal prosecutor. Are you sure you're just a nurse?" "Just a nurse who learned to cover her bases," Claire replied. That evening, she returned to her apartment exhausted but wired, unable to settle. She heated soup she didn't taste, tried to read a book she couldn't focus on, finally gave up and checked her encrypted messages. Amanda had sent an update. Initial search warrant executed at Brennan's office. Computer forensics team retrieved emails going back 8 years before IT could scrub them. What they're finding is worse than we thought. Multiple instances of patient care decisions overridden for financial reasons. Kickback schemes with medical suppliers. And Claire, evidence of witness intimidation that might constitute criminal conspiracy. This isn't just going to end his career, he's looking at federal prison time. Claire read the message twice, then sent back a single word. Good. But even as she typed it, she felt no satisfaction. Brennan would face justice, yes, but that wouldn't undo the damage. It wouldn't give back careers destroyed, wouldn't heal trauma inflicted, wouldn't restore the 7 years of fear that had permeated every corner of Westridge Memorial. Her phone rang. Not her personal phone, but the burner she kept for secure communications. She answered on the second ring. "This is Claire." A male voice, unfamiliar and strained. "Miss Donovan, you don't know me. My name is James Reeves. I was the ER physician who reported Brennan 6 years ago for assaulting a patient's family member." Claire sat up straighter. "The one who was named in the malpractice suit. That suit destroyed my career, my marriage, my financial stability. It was completely fabricated. Brennan manufactured evidence, paid off witnesses, used his connections to make it impossible for me to work anywhere in this state." His voice cracked slightly. "I heard what happened. I heard you actually got him suspended. I wanted to call because I have documents. Communications between Brennan and his attorneys about how they set me up. I kept copies of everything, even though my lawyer told me to destroy them. I always hoped someday there'd be a reckoning." "Dr. Reeves, the federal investigators need to see those documents." "I know. I'm sending them tomorrow, but I wanted to talk to you first to say thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to stand up when the rest of us couldn't, or when we tried and failed." After they hung up, Claire sat in the darkness and thought about all the James Reeveses in the world, people who'd tried to do the right thing and been crushed for it, who'd learned that speaking up meant losing everything, that powerful abusers were protected by systems designed to preserve institutional stability over individual justice. She thought about the version of herself that had existed before military service, before deployment to places where injustice wasn't a bug but a feature, before she'd understood that sometimes the only way to fight monsters was to become something they couldn't intimidate or destroy. Tuesday brought the media. Someone had leaked the story, either a board member covering their own exposure or an employee finally free to speak. And by morning, news vans lined the hospital parking lot. Reporters ambushed staff leaving shifts, asking for comments about the embattled CEO and allegations of systemic abuse. Claire avoided them, entering through a service entrance, but she couldn't avoid the impact. The story spread across local news, then regional, then caught the attention of national healthcare publications. Hospital CEO suspended amid assault allegations and federal investigation ran in the healthcare industry press. Patient advocacy groups issued statements. Former employees started coming forward on social media, sharing their own stories. The dam hadn't just broken, it had exploded. On Wednesday, Kenneth Voss resigned. No explanation, just a terse email to staff announcing his immediate departure and naming an interim HR director. The rumor mill said he'd been offered immunity in exchange for testimony about how he'd systematically buried complaints and destroyed evidence on Brennan's orders. Thursday brought a development that made Claire's blood run cold. She arrived home to find her apartment door unlocked, the security chain hanging loose. She stopped in the hallway, every instinct screaming danger, and called Amanda instead of entering. "Don't go inside," Amanda said immediately. "I'm sending local police and our security team. Stay in the hallway where there are witnesses." The police arrived within 10 minutes, cleared the apartment, and found nothing obviously stolen or damaged. But someone had been inside. Her laptop had been moved slightly, her documents rifled through with care, but not quite enough care. The message was clear. "We can reach you anywhere." The detective taking her statement was sympathetic but limited. "Without evidence of forced entry or theft, there's not much we can charge. Could have been a building maintenance issue, someone checking for a gas leak, or someone trying to intimidate a witness in a federal investigation," Claire said flatly. The detective's expression shifted. "Are you involved in an active federal case?" "I'm a witness in an investigation of Dr. Marcus Brennan." Understanding dawned on his face, followed by something like respect. "You're the nurse who put him on the floor. I saw the security footage. My wife works in medical records at Westridge. Half the city's seen it by now." He flipped his notebook closed. "I'll make sure this gets routed to the federal investigators. Breaking and entering to intimidate a federal witness carries serious charges." Claire spent that night in a hotel room Amanda arranged, under a name that didn't appear in any database connected to her real identity. She lay awake, listening to unfamiliar sounds, thinking about how far Brennan's reach extended, how desperate he must be to resort to tactics this crude. Friday morning brought the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. Federal investigators held a press conference announcing a multi-count indictment against Marcus Brennan for healthcare fraud, witness tampering, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The charges carried potential prison time of 15 to 20 years. But that wasn't the real news. The real news came in the final paragraph of the indictment, the part that made Claire close her eyes in grim satisfaction. The federal investigation had expanded to include the hospital board members who'd enabled Brennan's behavior, the HR practices that had systematically covered up abuse, and the institutional structures that had allowed one man to operate with impunity for more than a decade. Westridge Memorial Hospital itself was under investigation. The board held an emergency meeting that afternoon and emerged with a statement announcing Brennan's permanent termination, the dissolution of several administrative positions, and a commitment to comprehensive cultural reform. They appointed an interim CEO, a woman named Dr. Lisa Tran, who'd run a respected hospital in Seattle and had a reputation for zero tolerance of workplace abuse. Dr. Tran's first official act was to hold an all-staff meeting. Claire attended, sitting in the back of the auditorium as hundreds of employees filed in, their faces carrying everything from hope to skepticism to barely suppressed rage. Dr. Tran didn't waste time with platitudes. She stood at the podium, looked out at the crowd, and said, "I've read the reports. I've seen the documentation. I've spoken with some of you individually. And I want to say plainly, what happened here was systemic abuse enabled by institutional failure. The board failed you, HR failed you, leadership failed you, and I'm here to make sure that never happens again." The auditorium was absolutely silent. Starting today, we're implementing new reporting structures that bypass local HR entirely for complaints of abuse or retaliation. We're conducting a full review of staffing policies, compensation practices, and workplace safety protocols. We're bringing in independent consultants to assess our culture and recommend changes. And most importantly, we're listening. If you have concerns, if you've witnessed misconduct, if you have ideas for how to fix this institution, I want to hear them. Someone in the middle of the room started clapping. Then another person joined. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding not with celebration, but with something deeper: relief, validation, the release of years of suppressed hope that someone in power might actually care. Claire didn't applaud. She watched, assessing, evaluating whether this was genuine reform or performative damage control. Time would tell. Institutions change slowly, if at all, and good intentions often withered when they collided with entrenched interests and the hard reality of budget constraints and competing priorities. But it was a start. And after 7 years of nothing, a start meant everything. Saturday morning, 1 week after Claire had put Marcus Brennan on the floor of Westridge Memorial Hospital, she received a call from an unknown number. Ms. Donovan, this is Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Park. I'm lead prosecutor on the Brennan case. Do you have a few minutes to talk? They spoke for 40 minutes, Park walking Claire through the case being built, the evidence compiled, the testimony being gathered. The picture that emerged was damning. Brennan hadn't just been an abusive boss, but had orchestrated a criminal enterprise that defrauded Medicare of millions, accepted kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies, altered patient records to justify unnecessary procedures, and when anyone threatened to expose the schemes, systematically destroyed them through a combination of legal harassment, professional blackballing, and outright intimidation. Your incident was the catalyst, Park said, but it was the tip of an iceberg that goes down very deep. We're looking at RICO charges, Ms. Donovan. Organized criminal activity. This isn't just about one assault. It's about years of systematic corruption. How can I help? Claire asked. You're already helping. Your documentation has been invaluable, but I want you to understand something. Brennan's defense is going to come after you hard. They'll try to paint you as the aggressor, question your motives, dig into every corner of your background. It won't be pleasant. I've survived worse interrogations than a defense attorney can manage. Park paused at something in Claire's tone. I've noticed your documentation skills are unusually sophisticated. The way you've preserved evidence, created chains of custody, maintained contemporaneous notes. It's almost like you've had training in building prosecutable cases. Claire said nothing, letting the silence stretch. Well, that's, Park said finally. Whatever your background, we're grateful for it. This case is going to change how healthcare institutions handle workplace abuse. You've done something remarkable here. After the call ended, Claire stood at her hotel room window, looking out at the city where she'd spent less than 2 months, but which would probably remember her name for years. She thought about all the Westridge memorials across the country, all the Marcus Brennans who terrorized their staffs and got away with it because speaking up meant professional suicide. She thought about the military bases where she'd watched men abuse their authority while commanders looked away. The forward operating bases where assault victims were told to stay quiet for unit cohesion. The times she'd filed reports that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes while perpetrators got promoted. This time had been different. This time, the system had actually responded. Whether that meant the system was changing, or whether it just meant she'd finally learned how to make it respond the way it should, she wasn't sure. Her encrypted phone buzzed. Amanda. Brennan's attorney's requesting plea negotiations. He's looking at maximum sentences and knows it. How do you feel about him making a deal? Claire typed back. What would the deal include? Full cooperation, testimony against board members and others involved, financial restitution, permanent surrender of medical licenses, guilty plea to multiple felonies, prison time negotiable but likely 5 to 7 years minimum. Claire stared at the message. Part of her wanted Brennan to face maximum consequences, to suffer every possible penalty for the damage he'd inflicted. But another part, the practical part that had learned how justice actually worked, understood that his cooperation could take down an entire network of enablers and create systemic change that would protect future victims. Let him deal if it means protecting more people going forward, she typed, but not without real prison time. He needs to understand that power doesn't make you untouchable. Amanda's response came quickly. Agreed. I'll let the prosecutors know. Claire, you should know that your name is being discussed in some interesting circles. People who handle cases like this, who build prosecutions against institutional abuse. When this is over, if you're interested, there might be opportunities to do this work more officially. Claire looked at her reflection in the dark window. The quiet nurse with the calm gray eyes stared back, but underneath that surface was something else. Someone forged in places where justice was rare and power was everything. Someone who'd learned to operate in systems designed to protect the guilty. Someone who'd decided that wasn't acceptable anymore. Maybe, she typed. Let's finish this first. That night, she finally allowed herself to return to her apartment. Security had been upgraded, new locks installed, and she'd been assured that the building management would be monitoring access more carefully. She packed methodically, her belongings fitting into 2 suitcases and a backpack, ready to move quickly if necessary. Her real phone rang just before midnight. The caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in years, one she'd hoped never to see again. She answered. Hello, Dad. Her father's voice carried across the line, gruff and uncomfortable with emotion as always. Saw you on the news. Well, I saw the story. They didn't use your name, but I knew. Knew it was you the moment they described what happened. Dad, you remember what I told you before you deployed? That the military would teach you to fight, but it couldn't teach you when to fight? That you'd have to figure that part out yourself? Claire closed her eyes, remembering that conversation in the airport, her father's weathered face struggling to express concern without showing weakness. I remember. You figured it out, kid. You fought the right fight at the right time. I'm proud of you. The words hit harder than she expected, bringing tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed through any of the chaos. Thank you. But Claire, be careful. Men like this, Brennan, when they're cornered, they don't think straight. Promise me you're watching your back. I promise. After they hung up, she sat in the darkness and let herself feel it. The weight of what she'd started, the lives that had been changed, the system that had finally, grudgingly responded the way it should. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attacks, new complications. But tonight, for just a moment, she allowed herself to believe that justice was possible, that standing up mattered, that one person refusing to be intimidated could start avalanches. Her encrypted phone buzzed one final time, a message from a number she didn't recognize. Claire Donovan, we've been watching your case with great interest. When you're ready for your next mission, we should talk. DOJ, Special Prosecutions Division. She stared at the message, then at the packed suitcases, then out at the city lights of Riverside Falls. Somewhere out there, Marcus Brennan was probably plotting his next move, probably convinced he could still win, still escape, still emerge victorious because powerful men always did. He had no idea what was waiting for him in federal court, had no idea how thoroughly his empire had been documented, dissected, and prepared for destruction. Had no idea that the quiet nurse he'd tried to intimidate had spent years learning how to dismantle exactly the kind of system he'd built. But he was about to find out, and Claire Donovan was just getting started. The federal courthouse in downtown Riverside Falls occupied an entire city block, its limestone facade and bronze doors designed to project permanence and authority. Claire arrived 40 minutes before her scheduled testimony, passing through security with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to checkpoints. The metal detector beeped once, her watch, and she removed it without comment, collected it on the other side, and followed the assistant U.S. attorney's paralegal to a small witness preparation room on the third floor. Michelle Park was already there, surrounded by file boxes and a laptop displaying what looked like a timeline stretching across multiple screens. She looked up when Claire entered, her expression a mixture of focus and fatigue. "How are you feeling?" Park asked. "Ready." Brennan's lead attorney is Richard Castellanos, former prosecutor turned defense about 15 years ago, specializes in white-collar crime and medical malpractice defense. He's very good at creating reasonable doubt by attacking witness credibility. Park pulled up a document on her screen. He's going to come at you hard on 3 fronts: your background, your motivations, and your actions that night. He'll suggest you provoked Brennan deliberately, that you used excessive force, that you had ulterior motives for being at Westridge Memorial. Will he find anything in my background? Park's eyes sharpened slightly. That depends on what's there to find. Your nursing credentials check out perfectly. Your employment history has some gaps that he'll probe, but gaps aren't crimes. Is there anything I should know about before we walk into that courtroom? Claire held her gaze. Nothing that changes the facts of what happened. Brennan tried to hit me. I stopped him using minimal necessary force. 23 witnesses saw it, and security footage confirms it. Just understand that Castellanos doesn't need to prove you're lying. He just needs to plant enough doubt that the jury questions your version of events. He's going to make you uncomfortable. That's his job. I've been interrogated by people who made waterboarding look merciful, Claire said quietly. A defense attorney asking pointed questions doesn't intimidate me. Park studied her for a long moment, clearly hearing something in that statement that raised questions she was professional enough not to ask. All right, let's review your testimony one more time. They spent 30 minutes going through the sequence of events, Claire's arrival at Westridge Memorial, the pattern of behavior she'd observed, the escalating confrontations, the night Brennan attempted to strike her. Park coached her on how to answer precisely without volunteering additional information, how to handle hostile cross-examination, how to maintain composure under pressure. Remember, Park said as they finished, this isn't just about convicting Brennan. This case is being watched by healthcare institutions across the country. Your testimony represents every employee who's been abused by someone in power and told to stay quiet. The jury needs to see you as credible, sympathetic, and unshakable. The courtroom was smaller than Claire expected, more intimate. The jury box held 12 people and 2 alternates, a demographic cross-section of Riverside Falls, ranging from a young man in his 20s to an elderly woman who watched everything with sharp, assessing eyes. The gallery was packed with reporters, former Westridge Memorial employees, and observers from various healthcare advocacy organizations. Marcus Brennan sat at the defense table wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide how much weight he'd lost in the past 6 weeks. His silver hair was still immaculate, but his face had developed new lines, deep grooves around his mouth that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. His eyes locked onto Claire as she entered, and something flickered there. Rage, yes, but also fear. Judge Martin Harrison presided, a black man in his early 60s with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and zero tolerance for theatrics. He reviewed the witness list, reminded both counsels about proper decorum, and nodded to Park. The prosecution may call its next witness. The United States calls Claire Donovan. Claire walked to the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The whole truth. Nothing but the truth. She sat, adjusted the microphone, and waited. Park led her through the direct examination methodically. Claire described her hiring at Westridge Memorial, her initial observations of staff behavior, the culture of fear that permeated the hospital. She recounted specific incidents: Brennan berating residents, the suspicious blocking of Dr. Marsh's patient care orders, the systematic intimidation of anyone who questioned his authority. Ms. Donovan, can you describe the evening of October 15th? Park asked. Claire kept her voice level, her hands folded calmly in her lap. I was assigned to the ER due to staffing shortages. We had a patient, Kelly Martinez, who'd been in a serious car accident. She was in significant pain from pelvic fractures, and her prescribed pain medication had been delayed by pharmacy. I was working with the physician to find alternative pain management when Dr. Brennan appeared. What was his demeanor? Angry. He complained that he could hear the patient crying from his office and demanded to know why I hadn't resolved the situation faster. What happened next? He grabbed my arm and pulled me into the hallway. He told me I was incompetent and creating a disturbance. I pulled my arm free and told him not to touch me. He became more agitated and raised his hand as if to strike me across the face. What did you do? I defended myself. I redirected his arm, applied a control hold to his wrist and elbow, and guided him to the ground in a way that prevented him from completing the assault without causing him injury. Had you been trained in this type of defensive technique? Yes. I served as a combat medic in the military and received extensive training in personal defense and patient restraint techniques. Park walked her through the aftermath: the security response, the witness statements, Brennan's threats and accusations. She introduced photographs of the bruises on Claire's arm from where Brennan had grabbed her, security footage showing the assault attempt, written statements from 17 different witnesses. Ms. Donovan, why didn't you simply move away when Dr. Brennan raised his hand? Because directly behind me was Kelly Martinez's room. If I'd stepped back, he would have had clear access to a vulnerable patient in severe pain. My job is to protect patients, even from hospital administrators. It was a perfect answer, and Park let it hang in the air before concluding her direct examination. Richard Castellanos rose for cross-examination. He was shorter than Claire expected, probably 5'8", but he moved with the confidence of someone who'd demolished thousands of witnesses. He adjusted his reading glasses and smiled pleasantly. Ms. Donovan, you testified that you served as a combat medic in the military. Which branch? Army. And where were you deployed? Various locations in the Middle East and Central Asia. Can you be more specific? Some of my deployments remain classified. Castellanos raised his eyebrows. Classified military deployments. How convenient that we can't verify that. Park stood. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Harrison said. Mr. Castellanos, ask questions, don't editorials. Castellanos nodded, apparently unbothered. Ms. Donovan, these classified deployments, did they involve combat situations? Yes. Did you ever use lethal force? Park was on her feet immediately. Objection. Relevance. Your Honor, the witness's propensity for violence is directly relevant to the events of October 15th. Judge Harrison frowned. I'll allow limited exploration, but tread carefully, Mr. Castellanos. Miss Donovan, did you kill anyone during your military service? Claire met his eyes without flinching. I was a medic. My job was to save lives, not take them. But I served in combat zones where self-defense was sometimes necessary. Yes. How many people did you kill? I don't keep count of defensive actions taken under fire in war zones, Mr. Castellanos. More than one? Objection, Park said sharply. This is harassment. Overruled, Judge Harrison said, though he looked uncomfortable. The witness will answer. Yes, Claire said quietly. More than one. Castellanos let that answer settle over the courtroom. So you're trained in lethal combat techniques. You've killed multiple people, and we're supposed to believe that when my client, a 60-year-old administrator with no combat training, raised his hand, you were defending yourself rather than demonstrating your superior tactical abilities? Your client is 6'2" and outweighs me by 80 pounds. He grabbed me hard enough to leave bruises. He attempted to strike me in front of witnesses. I used the minimum force necessary to prevent the assault. If I'd wanted to demonstrate my tactical abilities, as you put it, Dr. Brennan would have required medical attention. Several jurors' eyes widened. Castellanos' pleasant expression slipped slightly. Let's talk about your employment history, Ms. Donovan. You worked at 3 different hospitals in the 2 years before coming to Westridge Memorial. That's a lot of job changes. Contract positions. I specialized in temporary placements in understaffed facilities. Or perhaps you had difficulty maintaining employment? The contracts were completed successfully. I have positive performance reviews from all 3 facilities. Do you? Castellanos consulted his notes. Because I notice there are gaps in your employment records. Months where you don't appear to have worked anywhere at all. I took time between contracts. That's not unusual. What did you do during those gaps? Personal business, travel, continued education. Can you provide specifics? Claire paused, knowing this was the trap. If she provided too much detail, he'd pick it apart. If she provided too little, she'd seem evasive. I prefer to keep my personal life private. How convenient, Ms. Donovan, isn't it true that these employment gaps correspond with periods where you were conducting some sort of investigation or reconnaissance? No. Isn't it true that you came to Westridge Memorial specifically to target Dr. Brennan? I came to Westridge Memorial to work as a nurse. But you knew about Dr. Brennan's reputation before you applied, didn't you? Claire chose her words carefully. I learned about the hospital's culture after I was hired. That's not what I asked. Did you know about allegations against Dr. Brennan before you submitted your application? The courtroom went quiet. This was the critical question, the one that could unravel everything if Claire wasn't careful. If she admitted prior knowledge, Castellanos would paint her as a vindictive crusader who'd engineered the entire confrontation. If she denied it, and he produced evidence to the contrary, her credibility was destroyed. I researched the hospital before applying, yes. That research included employee reviews and some mention of difficult management. That's true of most hospitals. But you applied anyway, even though you knew the CEO had a reputation for aggression. Most hospitals have challenging administrators. That doesn't excuse assault. Castellanos smiled. So you walked into what you knew was a toxic environment, worked there for less than a month, and somehow ended up in a physical confrontation with the CEO. That's quite a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that abusive leaders eventually abuse people. That's their pattern. Or perhaps it's not a coincidence that someone with military combat training and documented gaps in their employment history ends up in a position to physically dominate a hospital executive. Park stood. Objection. Counsel is testifying. Withdrawn. Castellanos turned to a new page in his notes. Ms. Donovan, how much force did you use when you put Dr. Brennan on the ground? Minimal necessary force to control the situation. You're trained in lethal techniques. How did you calibrate minimal in that moment? Years of training and experience, the same way physicians calibrate medication doses through education and practice. But you could have seriously injured my client. I could have, I didn't. That was intentional. Because you're so controlled, so professional, so perfectly calibrated in your response. Yes. Castellanos let the silence stretch, then pivoted abruptly. Ms. Donovan, have you been contacted by any federal law enforcement agencies during your employment at Westridge Memorial? The question landed like a grenade. Park tensed visibly. Claire kept her expression neutral. Could you be more specific? Have you had contact with the FBI, Department of Justice, or any other federal investigative body regarding Dr. Brennan or Westridge Memorial Hospital? Claire saw the trap clearly. If she said no, Castellanos might produce records of her contacts with Amanda or the federal investigators. If she said yes, he'd paint her as a government informant who'd infiltrated the hospital. I've cooperated fully with federal investigators after Dr. Brennan's assault, yes. Before the assault. Did you have contact before October 15th? I spoke with various people in my personal life. Some of those people may work for the government. I don't interrogate everyone I know about their employment. That's evasive, Ms. Donovan. It's accurate, Mr. Castellanos. Judge Harrison intervened. Mr. Castellanos, do you have evidence of specific contacts between the witness and federal investigators prior to the alleged assault? Castellanos hesitated. Not at this time, Your Honor. Then move on. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the question, had seen Claire's careful answer, had been invited to wonder whether she was more than just a nurse caught in an unfortunate situation. Castellanos pressed on for another 20 minutes, attacking her credibility from every angle, suggesting she'd used excessive force, questioning her motives, implying she'd somehow manipulated the situation for personal gain. Claire answered each question calmly, never losing her composure, never taking the bait when he tried to provoke an emotional response. Finally, he asked, Ms. Donovan, do you think you're a hero? Claire looked at him for a long moment. No, I think I'm someone who was assaulted at work and defended herself. That shouldn't require heroism. Castellanos had no response to that. He returned to the defense table and Park declined to re-examine. As Claire stepped down from the witness stand, her legs felt unsteady for the first time. She'd maintained perfect control during testimony, but the accumulated stress hit her all at once. She made it to the prosecution's table, sat down, and focused on breathing normally, while Park leaned over and whispered, You did beautifully. Castellanos threw everything at you, and you didn't break. The trial continued for 2 more days. Dr. Sarah Lynn testified about the assault attempt and the culture of fear at Westridge Memorial. Jennifer described being grabbed by Brennan and too terrified to report it. Michael Torres from security authenticated the video footage and confirmed that multiple employees had tried to report Brennan's behavior over the years, only to have their complaints disappear. The most devastating testimony came from Dr. James Reeves, the ER physician Brennan had destroyed 6 years earlier. Reeves presented the communications he'd preserved, showing how Brennan and his attorneys had fabricated the malpractice case, manufactured evidence, and paid off witnesses to destroy Reeves's career. He told me directly that I could withdraw my assault complaint or watch my life be dismantled piece by piece, Reeves said, his voice steady but his hands shaking. I didn't believe him. I thought the system would protect me. I was wrong. Brennan's defense rested heavily on character witnesses, board members who testified to his professional achievements, colleagues who described him as demanding but fair, patients who praised the care they'd received at Westridge Memorial. But under cross-examination, Park systematically exposed their conflicts of interest, their financial ties to Brennan, their willingness to overlook abuse in service of institutional stability. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. Claire spent that time in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse, her phone silenced, trying to read a book she'd already forgotten twice. Amanda joined her on the second day, sitting across from her in companionable silence until Claire finally said, What if they don't convict? Then we moved to the federal charges, the RICO case, the Medicare fraud. We have multiple paths to justice here. But this one matters. This is the one that tells every hospital employee in the country that you can defend yourself against an abusive boss and the system will back you up. I know. Amanda's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then stood abruptly. Verdict's in. The courtroom packed within minutes, spectators cramming into every available seat and lining the walls. Claire took her place behind the prosecution table, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully neutral. Brennan sat rigid at the defense table, his attorneys flanking him like guards. Judge Harrison took his seat. Has the jury reached a verdict? The forewoman, a middle-aged woman who'd worked as a school principal, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of assault and battery, how do you find? We find the defendant, Marcus Brennan, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Reporters surged for the exits, typing frantically on their phones. Former Westridge Memorial employees embraced, some crying openly. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. On the charge of retaliation against a witness, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice? Guilty. 4 more charges, 4 more guilty verdicts. When it was finished, Marcus Brennan had been convicted on 7 counts, each carrying significant prison time. He sat motionless, his face gray, while his attorneys requested immediate bail pending appeal. Judge Harrison denied the request. Given the defendant's history of witness intimidation and the seriousness of these convictions, bail is revoked. The defendant will be remanded to custody pending sentencing. Brennan's head snapped up. You can't. I have a right to. Bailiff, Harrison said quietly, and 2 officers approached the defense table. For the second time, Claire watched Marcus Brennan being physically removed from a position of power. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just suspended or temporarily embarrassed. This time, he was being taken to jail, and everyone in the courtroom understood that he would never return to the position he'd abused for so long. As the bailiffs led him away, Brennan's eyes found Claire's across the courtroom. He stared at her with such concentrated hatred that several people near her took an involuntary step back. His mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear but could read clearly enough. This isn't over. Michelle Park found Claire in the hallway outside the courtroom, surrounded by reporters shouting questions that Claire ignored. We need to talk, Park said urgently. Privately. They found an empty conference room. Park closed the door and turned to Claire with an expression that combined triumph and worry. The guilty verdicts are huge, career-defining for this office, and precedent-setting for workplace assault cases. But Claire, you need to understand something. Brennan's not going to prison quietly. He's already convicted. What can he do? Appeal, for one. His attorneys are good, and they'll argue everything from jury bias to improper evidence admission. That process could take years. But he'll be in custody during the appeals. Most likely, yes, but that's not what worries me. Park pulled up her phone, showing Claire a news article published 20 minutes earlier. This is what worries me. The headline read, Convicted Hospital CEO alleges government conspiracy, claims witness was federal plant. Claire skimmed the article. Brennan's attorneys had released a statement suggesting that Claire was part of a coordinated federal operation to entrap their client, that she'd been inserted into Westridge Memorial specifically to provoke an incident that would justify the larger investigation. They don't have proof, Claire said. They don't need proof for a conspiracy theory. They just need enough smoke to create doubt. Park sat down heavily. Claire, I need to ask you directly. Were you working with federal investigators before you started at Westridge Memorial? The question hung between them. Claire could lie. Her cover was solid enough to withstand scrutiny, and Park had no way to prove contact with Amanda or the DOJ task force. But lying to a federal prosecutor carried its own risks, and Claire was tired of operating in shadows. I knew Westridge Memorial had problems before I applied, she said carefully. I knew that someone needed to document what was happening there. I had contacts who could ensure that documentation reached the right people if Brennan's behavior escalated. That's not a no. That's as specific as I can be without compromising people who helped me. Park rubbed her eyes. If Brennan's defense can prove you were operating as a government agent before the assault, it could invalidate portions of our case. They'd argue entrapment, improper investigation, poisoned evidence. Can they prove it? I don't know, can they? Claire thought about the encrypted communications, the burner phones that had been destroyed, the careful protocols Amanda had established to keep their contacts off any official record. No, they can't. You're sure? I'm sure. Park nodded slowly. Okay, then we proceed. Sentencing is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. The federal RICO case moves forward simultaneously. And Claire, you should prepare yourself for ongoing scrutiny. Brennan's conviction is going to make you famous, or at least infamous, in healthcare circles. People are going to want to know your story. I don't want fame. I know, but you're getting it anyway. The prediction proved accurate within hours. Claire's name trended on social media. Healthcare worker advocacy groups hailed her as a symbol of resistance against workplace abuse. News outlets requested interviews. A literary agent left 3 voicemails about book deals. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell her story. Claire ignored all of it. She returned to her apartment, packed her minimal belongings, and prepared to disappear the way she'd done after previous operations. But Amanda called before she could leave. "Don't run," Amanda said without preamble. "I know that's your instinct, but running now would validate every conspiracy theory Brennan's team is floating." "I'm not running. I'm relocating." "Same thing. Claire, the DOJ wants to offer you a position. Official. On record. Working with the Special Prosecutions Division investigating institutional abuse in healthcare settings." Claire sat down on her bed, surrounded by half-packed suitcases. "Why would they do that?" "Because you're phenomenal at it. Because cases like Brennan's are happening in hospitals across the country, and we need people who can infiltrate those systems, document the abuse, and build prosecutable cases. Because you've just proven that it's possible to hold powerful abusers accountable if someone's willing to do the work." "I'm a nurse, not a federal agent." "You're both. And we need both skill sets." Amanda paused. "They're offering you a choice, Claire. You can walk away, go back to regular nursing, pretend this never happened. Or you can formalize what you've been doing anyway and actually get paid for it with federal resources backing you up." "What about my cover? If I work officially for DOJ, that information becomes discoverable." "Not if you're operating under the same protocols as other undercover investigators. Your identity would be protected, your communications privileged, your operations legally sanctioned. Everything you did off-book at Westridge Memorial could be done properly, with oversight and support." Claire looked around her small apartment, at the temporary life she'd built, at the pattern she'd been following for years, insert herself into broken systems, document the damage, then disappear before anyone could look too closely at who she really was. "I need to think about it." "You have 48 hours. After that, the offer expires and you're on your own if Brennan's appeals uncover something we can't protect you from." That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness thinking about all the Westridge memorials that existed, all the Marcus Brennans who terrorized their institutions, all the victims who stayed silent because speaking up meant professional destruction. She thought about Dr. James Reeves, whose career had been ruined for trying to do the right thing. About Jennifer, who'd been grabbed and threatened and told to accept it as the price of employment. About the surgical resident in Montana who'd fled rather than face Brennan's retaliation. And she thought about the moment in the ER corridor when Brennan had raised his hand to strike her, confident that no one would stop him because no one ever had. Her phone rang at 2 a.m. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Ms. Donovan?" The voice was young, female, frightened. "You don't know me. My name is Rachel Kim. I'm a resident at Riverside County Medical Center. I saw the news about Dr. Brennan's conviction, and I need help." Claire sat up, suddenly alert. "What's happening?" "My department chief. He does the same things Brennan did. Threats, intimidation, inappropriate touching. Last week, he cornered me in a supply closet and..." Her voice broke. "I tried to report it. HR told me there was no evidence, and I should consider whether making accusations would impact my career. I don't know what to do, but when I saw what you did, how you stopped Brennan, I thought maybe..." "Have you documented the incidents?" "Some of them. I have text messages from him. A few other residents have witnessed things, but they're too scared to say anything official." Claire closed her eyes, feeling the weight of what this call represented. Rachel Kim was one of thousands. Riverside County Medical Center was one of hundreds. And if Claire walked away now, Rachel would face the same choice as everyone before her: stay silent and survive, or speak up and be destroyed. "Rachel, I need you to keep documenting everything. Dates, times, witnesses, exact words if possible. Don't keep the documentation at work or on hospital computers, and I'm going to connect you with some people who can help. Will they actually do something, or will it be like HR, where they just protect the institution? They'll do something, I promise you that. After the call ended, Claire sat in the darkness for a long time. Then she sent Amanda a single text. "I'm in. Tell DOJ I accept." The response came within minutes. "Good. Welcome aboard. First assignment briefing Monday. We've already got 3 cases lined up." Claire stared at the message, then at the ceiling, then at the future that had just opened in front of her. No more operating in shadows. No more carefully constructed cover identities that had to be abandoned every few months. No more pretending to be just a nurse when she was so much more. She thought Brennan would hate knowing that his conviction hadn't ended anything. It had just made it official. The following weeks passed in a blur of transition. Claire met with DOJ attorneys, signed official paperwork, received her credentials as a special investigator attached to the Healthcare Fraud and Abuse Division. They assigned her a handler, a veteran prosecutor named Thomas Green, who'd built his career on institutional corruption cases. "Your job is to go where we can't," Green explained during their first briefing. "Hospitals, clinics, care facilities where we suspect abuse but can't prove it because everyone's too terrified to talk. You get hired, you observe, you document. When you have enough evidence, we move in with warrants and investigations. And if someone tries what Brennan tried, if they assault me or threaten me, then you defend yourself, we arrest them, and we add assault of a federal officer to their charges. You're not unprotected anymore, Claire. You're an extension of federal law enforcement, and that comes with resources." The reality of her new role settled over her: legitimacy, authority, backup. Everything she'd lacked when she'd walked into Westridge Memorial alone. But it also came with restrictions: official protocols, chain of command, oversight from people who'd never worked on a hospital floor or understood the culture she'd be infiltrating. Claire had spent years operating with complete autonomy, making decisions in real time based on rapidly evolving situations. Could she function within a bureaucratic structure? She was about to find out. Her first official assignment came 2 weeks later: St. Catherine's Hospital, in a city 300 miles north, where multiple nurses had filed complaints about a cardiac surgeon who allegedly retaliated against anyone who questioned his clinical decisions. 2 of those nurses had been fired under questionable circumstances. One had been physically shoved during an argument about patient care. "We need someone inside," Green said, "someone who can witness the behavior, document patterns, and gather testimony from frightened staff." "When do I start?" "Your interview is scheduled for next Monday. You're applying as an experienced OR nurse looking to relocate." Claire studied the file Green provided: personnel records, complaint documentation, financial data showing the surgeon brought in millions annually in surgical revenue, making him virtually untouchable despite his behavior. It was Westridge Memorial all over again. Different location, different names, same fundamental problem: power protecting itself at the expense of everyone beneath it. But this time would be different. This time, Claire had the full backing of federal law enforcement. This time, when she documented abuse and built a case, there would be no question about jurisdiction or authority. This time, the institution couldn't bury the evidence or intimidate witnesses into silence. This time, justice would have teeth. The night before Claire was scheduled to leave for St. Catherine's, Michelle Park called with news about Brennan's sentencing hearing. Judge Harrison sentenced him to 18 years, consecutive sentences on all counts, no possibility of parole for at least 12 years. He also ordered full restitution to victims and permanent revocation of all medical licenses. Claire absorbed the information. 18 years. Brennan was 60 years old. He'd be nearly 80 before he walked free, if he survived prison at all. "How did he react?" she asked. "Badly. He gave a statement claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy, that you'd entrapped him, that federal prosecutors had manufactured evidence. The judge shut him down pretty quickly." Park paused. "Claire, you should know. Brennan's attorneys filed a motion claiming they have evidence you were operating as a federal agent at Westridge Memorial. They're demanding access to all DOJ communications." Claire's chest tightened. "What did the judge rule?" "Motion denied. Harrison said that even if you had federal contacts, which they haven't proven, It doesn't change the fact that Brennan assaulted you in front of witnesses. Your background doesn't make his actions legal. But the appeals will probably raise it again. And Claire, there's something else. After sentencing, when the bailiffs were taking Brennan away, he looked directly at the gallery where you were sitting and said, "She'll pay for this. One way or another, she'll pay." The threat hung in the air between them. "That's witness intimidation," Claire said. "From a convicted felon being led to prison, yes. We've added it to his file. But Claire, you need to take this seriously. Men like Brennan have resources even from inside, and he's desperate enough to use them." Claire thanked Park and ended the call, but the unease remained. She'd made an enemy of someone who'd spent his entire life crushing anyone who opposed him. Prison wouldn't change that fundamental nature. It would just make him more creative about how he struck back. Her encrypted phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number routed through multiple proxies. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts." Claire stared at the message, then at the case file for St. Catherine's Hospital sitting on her desk. She could walk away. Except that Brennan was in prison, the immediate threat was neutralized. Her work at Westridge Memorial was complete. But Rachel Kim's frightened voice echoed in her memory. And behind Rachel were thousands of others, working in institutions where power meant impunity and speaking up meant destruction. Claire deleted the threatening message, opened her laptop, and began researching St. Catherine's Hospital. She had an interview to prepare for, a new identity to establish, another broken system to infiltrate. Brennan had promised she'd pay for destroying his empire. He had no idea what he'd actually created, a hunter who now had official sanction, federal resources, and a mission that extended far beyond one corrupt hospital. Somewhere in a prison cell, Marcus Brennan was plotting revenge. Somewhere in a quiet apartment, Claire Donovan was preparing for her next operation. And in hospitals across the country, abusive leaders were continuing to terrorize their staffs, completely unaware that the system that had always protected them was about to change. The war wasn't over. It had barely begun. And Claire Donovan had just been given an army. 3 weeks after Brennan's sentencing, Claire stood in the surgical lounge at St. Catherine's Hospital, listening to Dr. Nathan Cross berate a scrub nurse for a sterile field breach that hadn't actually occurred. The nurse, a woman named Amy Chen with 15 years of OR experience, stood with her head down, accepting the verbal assault without defense, exactly the way Claire had seen dozens of others do at Westridge Memorial. "You're incompetent," Cross was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone of controlled rage that Claire had learned to recognize as a precursor to violence. "You compromise patient safety, you waste my time, and frankly, I question whether you should even be working in a surgical environment." Amy's hands trembled. "Dr. Cross, I followed protocol exactly." "The field was never compromised. Are you arguing with me? Are you actually standing here arguing with a surgeon about sterile technique?" Claire intervened smoothly, stepping between them with a chart in hand. "Dr. Cross, OR 3 is ready for your next case. The patient's been prepped and anesthesia is standing by." Cross's eyes snapped to Claire, assessing this interruption. She'd been at St. Catherine's for exactly 17 days, long enough to establish herself as competent, but not long enough to be part of the existing power dynamics. She met his gaze calmly, offering him an exit from the confrontation that didn't require backing down from Amy. "Fine," he said finally, "but I want Chen off my cases. Permanently." He left, his surgical cap still in his hand, and Amy sagged against the counter. "Thank you," she whispered, "but you shouldn't have done that. He'll target you now." "Let him try." Claire had been documenting everything since her arrival, Cross's pattern of verbal abuse, the way he threw instruments during procedures when frustrated, the surgical complications that seemed to cluster around his cases, but were always blamed on nursing staff or equipment failures. She'd recorded conversations using the device DOJ had provided, disguised as a standard nurse's badge. She'd collected testimony from 6 different staff members willing to speak confidentially, and she'd identified the same structural problem that had enabled Brennan. Cross generated massive revenue for the hospital, making administration willing to overlook behavior that would get anyone else immediately terminated. But Cross was smarter than Brennan in one critical way. He was careful about physical contact. He yelled, threatened, humiliated, but he kept his hands to himself. That made him harder to catch in an act that would justify immediate intervention. Claire's encrypted phone buzzed during her lunch break. A message from Thomas Green. Brennan filed emergency appeal. Claims new evidence proves federal entrapment. Hearing scheduled for next week. She stared at the message, feeling ice crystallize in her stomach. Brennan had been in prison for 3 weeks. What new evidence could he possibly have? She called Green from her car, using the secure line DOJ had provided. What kind of evidence? She asked without preamble. His attorneys claim they have communications between you and federal investigators dating back to before your employment at Westridge Memorial. They're arguing that you were specifically inserted there to provoke an incident. That's impossible. All my communications with Amanda were encrypted and deleted. Apparently not all of them. Green's voice was grim. They have phone records showing calls between your number and a DOJ line 2 weeks before you started at Westridge. Short calls, probably just connection tests or brief check-ins, but enough to establish contact. Claire's mind raced. She remembered those calls, Amanda testing the encrypted setup, making sure the protocols worked. They'd been careful, but not careful enough. Phone metadata didn't reveal content, but it proved connection. Can they prove what was discussed? She asked. No, but they don't need to. They just need to create enough doubt that the assault conviction becomes questionable. If you were operating as a federal agent, then the incident becomes potential entrapment. I wasn't a federal agent then. I didn't have any official status. That's our argument. But Claire, you need to understand what this means. If the appeals court even partially buys Brennan's theory, it could invalidate portions of the case. He might get a reduced sentence or a new trial entirely. What about the other victims, the 47 employees who testified? Their testimony stands regardless, but the assault charge, the one that really captured public attention and set the precedent, that's vulnerable if they can prove you had federal connections before the incident. Claire closed her eyes, seeing the strategy clearly. Brennan couldn't dispute the facts of what happened, so he was attacking the context. He was trying to reframe the narrative from abusive CEO assaults nurse to federal agent provokes hospital executive. When's the hearing? She asked. Next Wednesday. You'll need to testify again. What do I say about the DOJ contacts? Green paused. The truth, that you had connections to people in federal law enforcement, but you weren't operating in any official capacity at Westridge Memorial. You were a concerned citizen who happened to have contacts that could ensure proper investigation if you witnessed illegal behavior. That sounds guilty as hell. It sounds honest, and right now, honesty is our best defense. That night, Claire couldn't focus on the St. Catherine's investigation. She kept replaying the Westridge Memorial case, looking for mistakes, vulnerabilities, anything Brennan's attorneys might exploit. The phone records were damaging but not fatal. The real problem was if they could establish a pattern, if they could show she'd done this before, targeted other institutions, operated as an unofficial federal investigator without proper authorization. Her personal phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was local to Riverside Falls. Ms. Donovan? The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. My name is David Castellanos. I'm Richard Castellanos' son. My father asked me to reach out. Claire's hand tightened on the phone. Richard Castellanos was Brennan's lead attorney, the one who'd tried to destroy her credibility during trial. I'm not interested in speaking with Brennan's legal team. Please, just hear me out. This isn't about the appeal. Well, not directly. My father believes you're in danger. From who? From Marcus Brennan. We've received information suggesting Brennan has been making arrangements from prison. He's furious about the conviction and convinced you deliberately destroyed him. My father thinks Brennan might be planning retaliation. Claire processed this carefully. Why would your father care about warning me? I'm the witness who helped convict his client. Because my father's a defense attorney, not a criminal. He doesn't want blood on his hands if Brennan does something stupid. And between you and me, Ms. Donovan, he thinks you were telling the truth on the stand. He was doing his job, attacking your credibility, but he believes Brennan assaulted you. What kind of retaliation are we talking about? We don't have specifics, just overheard conversations with other inmates, references to settling scores, requests to contact certain people on the outside. Prison officials have been notified, but my father wanted to warn you directly. After the call ended, Claire sat in her car in the St. Catherine's parking lot, watching the evening shift change, nurses trudging to their cars in the fading light. She thought about Brennan in his cell, stripped of power but not powerless, using whatever connections remained to strike back at the woman who'd brought him down. She'd known this was possible, had prepared for it in fact, but preparation didn't eliminate the cold reality of being targeted by someone with nothing left to lose. Her DOJ phone buzzed. Thomas Green. Need to talk ASAP. New development. She called him back immediately. What's wrong? Two things. First, the judge presiding over Brennan's appeal is Walter Madsen. He's got a reputation as a law and order conservative, but he's also extremely skeptical of government overreach. If Brennan's team can frame this as federal agents manipulating an investigation, Madsen might be sympathetic. And second, we just received a motion from Brennan's attorneys demanding full disclosure of your employment history, security clearances, and any covert operations you've participated in. They're arguing that your background is directly relevant to whether you were acting as a government agent at Westridge Memorial. Claire felt the walls closing in. Her military service was mostly public record, but the classified deployments, the operations she'd been part of, the actual scope of what she'd done in combat zones, that information was sealed under layers of national security protocols. They can't access classified material, she said. No, but they can argue that the existence of sealed records proves you have a history of covert operations, which supports their entrapment theory. It's circumstantial, but combined with the phone records, it might be enough. So what do? We fight. We argue that your background is irrelevant to the facts of the case. We emphasize that Brennan assaulted you in front of witnesses regardless of who you are or what connections you have. We make this about his actions, not your history. But Claire could hear the doubt in Green's voice. He was a prosecutor, trained to anticipate defense strategies, and he understood how juries thought. If Brennan's team could paint Claire as a professional infiltrator, someone who made a career of targeting powerful people, it would poison everything. The appeals hearing was held in a federal courtroom that felt colder and more austere than the trial venue. Judge Walter Madsen presided with the demeanor of someone who'd seen every legal trick and wasn't impressed by any of them. He was 73, appointed to the bench during an administration that valued strict interpretation of law over judicial activism. Brennan's appeals team had expanded, 3 attorneys now instead of 2, including a specialist in federal procedure named Helena Voss, who had a reputation for dismantling government cases on technicality. Your Honor, Voss began, her voice measured and precise. This case represents a troubling example of federal overreach disguised as criminal prosecution. The government inserted an operative into Westridge Memorial Hospital with the explicit purpose of provoking an incident that would justify a larger investigation. That's not what happened, Michelle Park interjected, but Judge Madsen raised his hand. You'll have your turn, Ms. Park. Continue, Ms. Voss. Voss presented phone records showing 6 calls between Claire's number and DOJ lines in the 2 weeks before her hiring at Westridge Memorial. She presented employment records showing Claire had worked at 3 different hospitals in the previous 2 years, each time leaving shortly after complaints emerged about senior staff misconduct. This isn't coincidence, Your Honor. This is pattern. Ms. Donovan doesn't just happen to find herself in toxic work environments. She seeks them out. She's a professional witness, someone who infiltrates institutions and engineers confrontations that create prosecutable cases. Judge Madsen looked at Claire, who sat behind the prosecution table in a navy suit, her hands folded calmly despite the accusations being leveled. Ms. Park, your response. Park stood, her briefing materials organized with the precision of someone who'd anticipated every argument. Your Honor, the defense is trying to criminalize good citizenship. Ms. Donovan had concerns about Westridge Memorial based on public information. She had contacts in federal law enforcement, as many citizens do. None of that changes the fundamental facts. Dr. Brennan assaulted her in front of 23 witnesses. The security footage is unambiguous. His conviction rests on his actions, not her background. But if she was operating as a federal agent, Madsen said slowly, doesn't that raise questions about entrapment? She wasn't a federal agent. She had no official status, no badge, no authorization to conduct investigations. She was a nurse who witnessed criminal behavior and reported it to appropriate authorities. After provoking that behavior, Voss countered, Ms. Donovan deliberately inserted herself into situations where she knew Dr. Brennan would react poorly. She escalated confrontations instead of de-escalating them. She refused to comply with reasonable directives from her superior. Reasonable? Park's voice sharpened. Dr. Brennan tried to strike her across the face. There's nothing reasonable about that. Judge Madsen held up his hand again. I want to hear from Ms. Donovan directly. Approach the bench. Claire stood and walked forward, her heart rate steady despite the stakes. She'd testified before, faced hostile cross-examination, survived Richard Castellanos' attempts to destroy her credibility. But this felt different. This wasn't a jury to convince. It was a single judge who could unravel everything with one ruling. Ms. Donovan, Madsen said, his voice not unkind but deeply skeptical. Did you have contact with federal investigators before you began working at Westridge Memorial Hospital? Yes, Your Honor. The courtroom stirred. Voss smiled slightly. Park's expression remained neutral, but Claire could see the tension in her shoulders. What was the nature of those contacts? I have a friend who works for the Department of Justice. She and I discussed the fact that I was considering employment at hospitals with reported management issues. She advised me to document anything I witnessed that might constitute illegal behavior. This friend, did she suggest you apply to Westridge Memorial specifically? Claire paused, choosing her words with surgical precision. She made me aware that Westridge had a history of employee complaints that had never been properly investigated. I made the decision to apply independently. But you went there knowing you might witness illegal conduct. I went there knowing the hospital had problems. Every hospital has problems, Your Honor. Most of them don't involve CEOs assaulting staff members. Did you provoke Dr. Brennan deliberately? Claire met his eyes directly. I did my job. I advocated for patients. I followed protocols. If that provoked Dr. Brennan, it's because he couldn't tolerate competent staff who wouldn't be intimidated. Madsen studied her for a long moment. Ms. Donovan, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before answering. Have you done this before? Deliberately sought employment at institutions with problematic leadership for the purpose of documenting misconduct? This was the critical moment. Claire could lie. Her previous operations hadn't been officially sanctioned, and there were no records proving she'd targeted other hospitals. But lies had a way of being exposed, and perjury in federal court would destroy everything. Yes, she said quietly. I've worked at hospitals where I suspected problems and documented what I witnessed. I believe healthcare workers deserve safe environments, and I'm willing to put myself at risk to ensure that. So you're essentially a private investigator targeting medical institutions. I'm a nurse who believes in accountability. Voss stood. Your Honor, this admission proves our point exactly. Ms. Donovan is a professional operative who— I'm a nurse, Claire interrupted, her voice cutting through Voss's objection. I'm a nurse who served in combat zones where I watched people with power abuse that power without consequences. I came home and found the same patterns in civilian hospitals. Bosses who assault staff, administrators who cover it up, systems designed to protect institutions instead of people. So yes, I've documented that abuse when I've witnessed it. I've reported it to authorities who could actually do something about it, and I don't apologize for any of that. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Judge Madsen leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Here's what I'm struggling with, Ms. Donovan. The law is very clear about entrapment. If a government agent induces someone to commit a crime they wouldn't otherwise commit, that's entrapment. If you were working with federal investigators, even unofficially, and you deliberately provoke Dr. Brennan into assaulting you, that raises serious constitutional questions. I didn't provoke him, Your Honor. I existed in his space and refused to be bullied. If that's provocation, then every employee who stands up to an abusive boss is guilty of entrapment. Park seized the moment. Your Honor, may I present additional evidence? She approached the bench with a tablet. These are records from the 3 hospitals where Ms. Donovan previously worked. In each case, she filed formal complaints with HR before any federal investigation began. She followed proper channels, documented through official processes, gave the institutions every opportunity to address the problems internally. It was only when those institutions failed to act that federal authorities became involved. Madsen reviewed the documents, his finger scrolling through page after page. Claire watched his expression shift subtly, the skepticism giving way to something more thoughtful. "These complaints," he said finally, "were all filed before any DOJ contact." "Yes, Your Honor, Mrs." Donovan tried to work within existing systems. Those systems failed. She then reached out to federal authorities as a concerned citizen reporting criminal activity. Voss stood again. "Your Honor, we're not disputing that Ms. Donovan filed complaints. We're arguing that she deliberately engineered situations to create those complaints. She's a catalyst, someone who refused to be complicit in institutional abuse," Madsen said, his voice taking on an edge. "Ms. Voss, I've read the trial transcripts. I've reviewed the evidence. Dr. Brennan had a documented pattern of assault and intimidation spanning 7 years before Miss Donovan ever set foot in Westridge Memorial. Are you seriously arguing that she somehow caused all of that?" Voss's confidence flickered. "No, Your Honor, but because that's what you'd need to prove for an entrapment defense. You'd need to show that Dr. Brennan wouldn't have assaulted anyone if not for Miss Donovan's specific actions. But we have testimony from 47 different victims. We have evidence of systematic abuse going back over a decade. Ms. Donovan didn't create that pattern. She exposed it." Claire felt something shift in the room, a subtle change in atmospheric pressure that told her the tide was turning. "Your Honor," Voss tried again, "we're simply asking for disclosure of Ms. Donovan's full background so the court can assess." "I've assessed enough," Madsen said flatly. "Motion for new trial is denied. The conviction stands." Brennan, who'd been sitting silently at the defense table throughout the hearing, surged to his feet. "You can't. She's a government plant. She fabricated everything. This whole trial was a setup." "Mr. Brennan, sit down," Madsen said sharply. "I will not sit down while this court legitimizes a conspiracy to—" "Bailiff." Madsen's voice cracked like a whip, and 2 officers moved toward Brennan. "Mr. Brennan, you're dangerously close to contempt charges. I suggest you control yourself." Brennan's attorneys pulled him back into his seat, whispering urgently, but his eyes remained locked on Claire with an intensity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Madsen continued, his tone brooking no argument. "I want to be absolutely clear about my reasoning here. Ms. Donovan's background, her contacts with federal law enforcement, even her decision to seek employment at troubled institutions, none of that changes what happened on October 15th. Dr. Brennan attempted to strike a nurse. That nurse defended herself. 23 people witnessed it. Security footage captured it. Those are facts, and they're not altered by who the nurse happened to be or what connection she had." He looked directly at Brennan. "You've spent your career believing that power makes you untouchable. You're learning, perhaps for the first time in your life, that it doesn't. Your conviction is affirmed. Your sentence stands. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. Brennan's attorneys immediately huddled, already planning their next appeal to a higher court. But Claire could see in their body language that they knew this was a losing battle. Madsen's ruling was thorough, well-reasoned, and would be difficult to overturn. Michelle Park found Claire in the hallway outside the courtroom. "You took a risk admitting you'd targeted other hospitals." "I took a bigger risk lying under oath." "True. But you gave them ammunition for future appeals." "Let them appeal. The facts don't change." Claire looked back at the courtroom doors. "He's never going to stop, is he, Brennan? He'll appeal every ruling, file every motion, spend his entire prison sentence trying to overturn the conviction." "Probably. But with each failed appeal, his credibility diminishes. Eventually, courts stop taking his claims seriously." Park hesitated. "Claire, there's something you should know. We received intelligence from prison officials. Brennan's been in contact with someone on the outside, someone who's been asking questions about you, where you live, where you work, your daily routines. The St. Catherine's assignment is being reassigned. Thomas Green wants you pulled immediately. The threat assessment is too high." Claire shook her head. "Nathan Cross is doing the same things Brennan did. If I leave now, nothing changes at St. Catherine's. If you stay, you might get hurt, or worse. Then increase my security. Give me backup, but don't pull me from an active case because Brennan's making threats from prison." Park studied her. "You're not going to back down, are you?" "Would you?" "Honestly, I don't know. I've never been in your position." That night, Claire returned to St. Catherine's for her scheduled shift, but with modifications to her routine that DOJ security had implemented. An undercover federal marshal worked as maintenance staff on her floor. Her car was swept daily for tracking devices. Her routes to and from work varied randomly. The apartment she'd rented for the assignment had additional security cameras and a direct line to local law enforcement. It felt excessive until she found the package. It was waiting outside her apartment door, unmarked brown box, professionally wrapped. Claire didn't touch it. She called the bomb squad, evacuated the building, and waited while technicians examined the package with robotic equipment. It wasn't a bomb. It was photographs, dozens of them, showing Claire at Westridge Memorial, at her current apartment, entering St. Catherine's Hospital. Surveillance photos taken over weeks, maybe months. And underneath the photos, a handwritten note in script that Claire recognized from court documents as Brennan's. "You think federal protection will save you. It won't. You destroyed my life. I will destroy yours. Not quickly. Slowly. I want you to feel what I felt, the loss of everything that matters. Watch your back, Claire. I have people everywhere." The federal response was immediate and overwhelming. FBI agents interviewed every person Brennan had contacted from prison. His cell was searched, his communications monitored, his visitation privileges revoked. They traced the package to a private courier service that had been paid in cash by someone using a fake name. Thomas Green arrived at Claire's apartment at midnight, accompanied by 2 U.S. Marshals and a protective detail that would have been appropriate for a high-level witness in a mob trial. "You're being moved to a safe house," Green said without preamble. "The St. Catherine's investigation is suspended pending resolution of the threat." "He wins if I hide. He wins if you're dead." "Claire, this isn't a suggestion. Brennan just committed witness intimidation and made terroristic threats from federal prison. That's additional charges, but more importantly, it proves he's willing to act on his hatred. We're taking this seriously, and so are you." The safe house was a suburban rental 40 minutes from St. Catherine's, unremarkable and deliberately forgettable. Claire spent 3 days there, reviewing the cross-case files, giving statements to FBI agents, watching her professional life contract to the size of a living room with drawn curtains. On the 4th day, Amanda Reeves arrived. "You look terrible, Lynn," Amanda said, setting down a bag of takeout food that smelled like the first real meal Claire had eaten in days. "I feel terrible. Brennan's playing a long game. He knows he can't hurt you directly from prison, so he's trying to make you afraid, make you ineffective, force you to withdraw from the work." Amanda opened containers of Thai food, the familiar ritual grounding the conversation. "He's betting that constant threats will accomplish what direct violence couldn't. It's working." "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, you're still analyzing case files and planning your return to St. Catherine's. That doesn't look like someone who's been intimidated into submission." Claire picked at the pad thai. "I can't do this work if I'm in protective custody. The whole point of these operations is that I can move freely, observe naturally, build trust with staff. None of that works with federal marshals following me around. So we need to eliminate the threat. Brennan's in maximum security. He's already facing additional charges for the intimidation. What more can we do?" Amanda pulled out a tablet, navigated to a secure file. "We can go after his network. Brennan didn't arrange that surveillance and send that package by himself. He's using outside contacts, probably former employees, maybe family members, possibly people he paid off during his years running Westridge Memorial. FBI is building a conspiracy case, but they need time to identify all the players." "How much time?" "Weeks, maybe months." Claire set down her food. "I don't have months. Nathan Cross is escalating at St. Catherine's. Last week he threw a surgical instrument at a scrub tech's head, missed by inches. If I'm not there documenting this, building a case, he's going to seriously hurt someone. Or Brennan's contacts are going to seriously hurt you." The 2 women stared at each other across the coffee table, the Thai food cooling between them, the fundamental tension unresolvable. Claire's work required her to be visible, accessible, embedded in dangerous environments. Brennan's threats required her to be hidden, protected, removed from those same environments. Both realities couldn't coexist. "There's a third option," Amanda said finally. "We end this faster. We don't wait for FBI to slowly unravel Brennan's network. We force them into the open. How? You go back to St. Catherine's. Publicly. Make yourself visible. Brennan's people will either back off because they know we're watching, or they'll make a move and we'll catch them. Either way, the threat resolves. Claire processed the strategy. You want to use me as bait. I want to use you as a federal investigator doing your job with appropriate security. If Brennan's network takes action, we arrest them. If they don't, you complete the cross investigation and we move to the next case. And if they're better at this than we anticipate, if they manage to hurt me despite the security, Amanda's expression hardened. Then we make absolutely certain that Brennan and everyone connected to him spends the rest of their lives in federal prison. But Claire, I don't think it comes to that. These aren't professional killers. They're bitter hospital administrators and yes men who prospered under Brennan's protection. Put real pressure on them, make them understand the consequences, and they'll fold. The decision crystallized in Claire's mind with the same clarity she'd felt in combat zones when choosing between imperfect options. She could hide indefinitely, let Brennan win through attrition, abandon the work that gave her life purpose. Or she could walk back into the fire, trust her training and her support system, and refuse to let one convicted abuser destroy everything she'd built. When do I return to St. Catherine's? She asked. Amanda smiled grimly. Tomorrow. But Claire, this time we're not subtle about the protection. Everyone will know you're a federal investigator now. The secrecy was already blown by Brennan's appeals. Might as well use it. The next morning, Claire walked into St. Catherine's Hospital, accompanied by two federal marshals in business casual attire who made no attempt to disguise their role. The hospital administration had been notified overnight that a federal investigation was active and that Claire Donovan was operating under official DOJ authorization. The response was immediate and polarizing. Some staff members approached her cautiously, asking quiet questions about what she was investigating. Others avoided her entirely, treating her presence like a contagion. And Nathan Cross, when he saw her in the surgical corridor flanked by her federal escorts, went absolutely pale. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice lacking its usual authority. Claire met his eyes calmly. "I'm completing my contract, Dr. Cross. These gentlemen are here for security reasons unrelated to hospital operations." "Security? Who are you, really?" "I'm a nurse and an investigator working with the Department of Justice Healthcare Fraud Division. If you have questions about that, you can direct them to the hospital's legal counsel." Cross stared at her, his mind clearly racing through implications. Every harsh word, every thrown instrument, every threat made in the heat of surgical stress, all of it potentially documented, potentially criminal, potentially career-ending. "I want to speak with hospital administration," he said finally. "That's certainly your right." He left, practically running toward the executive wing. Claire continued to the OR lounge where Amy Chen and 3 other nurses waited. "You're really with the government?" Amy asked, her voice trembling between hope and fear. "I'm really here to document workplace abuse and build cases against people who hurt healthcare workers. Everything you've told me, everything you've witnessed, I need you to be willing to testify formally, now. Not just to me, but to federal investigators." Amy looked at the other nurses. Some nodded. Others looked terrified. One woman, an older OR nurse named Barbara, stepped forward. "I've worked here 22 years. I've watched 3 good nurses quit because of Cross, watched him throw things, watched him grab people, watched him threaten anyone who questions him. If you can actually do something about it, if you can actually hold him accountable, then yes, I'll testify. I'll tell them everything." Within hours, the hospital was in controlled chaos. Hospital administration called emergency meetings. Nathan Cross retained an attorney. Staff members who'd remained silent for years suddenly found their voices, approaching Claire and her federal escorts with stories, with documentation, with years of suppressed anger finally finding an outlet. And somewhere in a federal prison, Marcus Brennan watched news coverage of the St. Catherine's investigation and understood, perhaps for the first time, that destroying Claire Donovan hadn't eliminated the problem. It had multiplied it. That evening, Claire's secure phone rang. The caller ID showed FBI headquarters. "Ms. Donovan, this is Special Agent Marcus Webb. We've made arrests in connection with the threats against you. 3 individuals, former Westridge Memorial administrators, who maintained contact with Brennan and arranged the surveillance and package delivery. They're cooperating fully in exchange for reduced charges. Claire sat down slowly. What are they saying? That Brennan's been running a pressure campaign from prison, trying to force you to withdraw from federal service. He believed if he made you afraid enough, you'd quit, and the larger investigation into healthcare institutional abuse would lose momentum. He was wrong on both counts. Is the threat eliminated? We believe so. These three were his primary outside contacts. Without them, he's isolated. We're adding conspiracy charges to his sentence, which likely means he'll never see parole. After the call ended, Claire stood at the window of her safe house, looking out at the suburban street where children played and dogs barked and life proceeded with the comfortable mundanity that had always felt foreign to her. She thought about Brennan in his cell, his empire dismantled, his network arrested, his threats impotent. She thought about the nurses at St. Catherine's who'd finally found the courage to speak. She thought about the dozens of other cases waiting in DOJ files, other institutions where powerful abusers operated with impunity, other victims waiting for someone to care enough to document their pain and demand accountability. Her phone buzzed. Thomas Green. Cross has resigned from St. Catherine's effective immediately. Hospital board is implementing new oversight protocols. State medical board has opened formal investigation. Good work. Claire typed back, "What's next?" The response came quickly. Virginia, major metropolitan hospital system. Chief of medicine with a 20-year pattern of sexual harassment and retaliation. 3 previous complaints buried by institution. Are you ready? Claire looked at her reflection in the dark window. The quiet nurse with the calm gray eyes stared back, but underneath was something forged in combat, tempered by years of watching injustice flourish, hardened by the understanding that systems only changed when someone forced them to. She typed one word, ready. But before she could send it, another message came through, this one from an unknown number that her phone immediately flagged as originating from inside federal prison. You haven't won. You've just delayed the inevitable. I will spend every day of my life making sure you pay for what you did. Sleep well, Claire. If you can. Claire stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. She returned to Green's message and hit send. Ready? Because Marcus Brennan could threaten all he wanted from his cell. He could appeal, scheme, plot revenge. But Claire had something he never understood and never would. She wasn't doing this for glory or power or revenge. She was doing it because it needed to be done. Because victims deserved advocates. Because institutional abuse only ended when someone refused to look away. And unlike Brennan, she had an army now. Federal investigators, prosecutors, marshals, and most importantly, the growing network of healthcare workers who'd found their voices because one nurse had shown them it was possible to fight back and survive. The war wasn't over. But the balance of power had fundamentally shifted. And in a federal prison cell, Marcus Brennan was beginning to understand that destroying Claire Donovan had been the worst mistake of his life. Not because of what it had cost him, though it had cost him everything, but because of what it had created, a hunter with federal sanction, unlimited resources, and a mission that extended far beyond one corrupt hospital. Marcus Brennan had wanted to make an example of Claire Donovan. Instead, he'd made a legend, and she was just getting started. 6 months later, Claire stood in the grand ballroom of the National Healthcare Workers Association Conference Center, surrounded by 3,000 nurses, physicians, and hospital administrators who'd gathered to hear her speak. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, forwarded through DOJ channels with a note from Thomas Green. They want to hear from you directly, your choice whether to accept. She'd almost declined. Public speaking wasn't part of her operational profile, and visibility carried risks she'd spent years learning to minimize. But Amanda had called her personally, making an argument Claire couldn't refute. You've helped convict 7 abusive healthcare executives in 6 months. You've changed policies at 14 hospitals. You've inspired hundreds of workers to come forward with their own stories. They need to see that you're real, that this work is possible, that speaking up doesn't have to mean professional suicide. So Claire had accepted, written her speech longhand in hotel rooms between investigations, and now stood backstage listening to the conference organizer introduce her with a biography that still felt like it described someone else. Claire Donovan served 8 years as an Army combat medic before transitioning to civilian nursing. In the past year, she's become the face of accountability in healthcare administration, working with federal investigators to document and prosecute institutional abuse. Her work led to the conviction of Dr. Marcus Brennan and has since expanded to hospitals across the country. Please welcome Claire Donovan. The applause was thunderous, sustained, almost overwhelming. Claire walked onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at thousands of faces watching her with expressions ranging from hope to skepticism to barely contained emotion. "I'm not comfortable with the word hero," she began, her voice steady despite the audience size. "Heroes are people who do extraordinary things in impossible situations. What I did at Westridge Memorial Hospital wasn't extraordinary. It was basic self-defense. The fact that it's being treated as revolutionary says more about how broken our systems are than about any courage I demonstrated." She paused, letting that sink in. "Marcus Brennan tried to hit me. I stopped him." That should have been the end of the story. A clear case of assault, swift consequences, immediate protection for other potential victims. Instead, it became a year-long legal battle, multiple appeals, death threats, and a federal investigation into why a hospital allowed one man to terrorize staff for 7 years without meaningful intervention. The ballroom was absolutely silent now, 3,000 people holding their breath. The answer to that question isn't complicated. Brennan generated revenue. He had connections. He'd built a network of enablers who prospered under his protection. And most importantly, everyone who tried to stop him was destroyed so thoroughly that others learned to stay silent. That's not a Westridge Memorial problem. That's a healthcare industry problem. Claire clicked to her first slide, showing statistics compiled by federal investigators. In the past 6 months, our team has documented abuse at 43 different medical facilities. We've identified patterns of assault, harassment, retaliation, and systematic cover-up that mirror what happened at Westridge Memorial. These aren't isolated incidents. This is institutional culture. She clicked through more slides. Testimonies, conviction records, policy changes implemented after investigations. Each slide represented months of work, dozens of interviews, countless hours of documentation. "But here's what gives me hope," Claire continued. "Every single case we've built has been possible because healthcare workers found the courage to speak up. Nurses who documented incidents despite being told to forget them. Physicians who reported colleagues despite professional consequences. Administrators who chose ethics over institutional loyalty. You are the ones creating change, not me. I'm just the person who happens to have federal backing when I walk into these situations." A hand shot up in the audience, a young woman in scrubs. Claire nodded to her. "How do we protect ourselves if we don't have federal investigators watching our backs?" the woman asked, her voice amplified by a microphone an assistant brought to her. "Most of us can't just call the DOJ when our boss threatens us." Claire had anticipated this question. "You document everything, dates, times, witnesses, exact words. You keep that documentation somewhere the institution can't access or destroy, personal email, cloud storage, physical copies at home. You report through official channels first, creating a paper trail. And when those channels fail, you reach out to outside authorities, state medical boards, Department of Health, even local law enforcement if the behavior is criminal." "But those systems failed at Westridge Memorial," another voice called out. "They fail everywhere." "They failed because too few people pushed back. Systems only change when enough pressure builds that maintaining the status quo becomes more costly than reform." Claire leaned forward, her intensity cutting through the distance between stage and audience. "I'm not naive enough to think one speech or one federal investigation will transform healthcare culture overnight. But I've seen what happens when victims become witnesses, when witnesses become advocates, when advocates refuse to be silenced. Brennan thought he was untouchable. He learned otherwise. So can every other abusive leader operating in our hospitals." The questions continued for 40 minutes, ranging from practical advice about documentation to philosophical discussions about institutional power. Claire answered each one directly, without softening the hard realities or offering false hope. When the session finally ended, the standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Backstage, Amanda waited with Thomas Green and a woman Claire didn't recognize. Mid-50s, wearing an expensive suit, carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Claire Donovan, meet Dr. Margaret Chen. newly appointed CEO of Westridge Memorial Hospital, Amanda said. Claire shook Chen's hand, studying her carefully. You took Brennan's job. I took the job of cleaning up the disaster he left behind, Chen corrected. And I wanted to meet you personally to say thank you. Your documentation, your testimony, your refusal to be intimidated, you didn't just convict one abuser. You exposed institutional failures that I've spent the past 6 months systematically dismantling. How's the staff doing? Slowly healing. We've implemented new reporting structures, brought in outside consultants to assess workplace culture, fired 3 senior administrators who enabled Brennan's behavior. It's not perfect, but it's better. People are starting to trust that complaints will be taken seriously. Chen paused. Several staff members asked me to give you something if I ever met you. She handed Claire a framed photograph. It showed the nurses' station on the 3rd floor of Westridge Memorial, where more than 30 staff members had gathered holding a banner. Thank you, Claire. You showed us courage is contagious. Claire stared at the image, feeling something crack in the professional armor she'd maintained throughout the conference. Patricia Huang stood in the center of the group, smiling. Jennifer was there too, and Dr. Sarah Lynn and Michael Torres from security. People who'd been terrified into silence had found their voices because one person had refused to accept abuse as inevitable. They wanted you to know you changed their lives, Chen said quietly. Not just by stopping Brennan, but by proving that institutional power isn't absolute, that fighting back is possible, that victims can become survivors. After Chen left, Claire found a quiet corner backstage and called a number she hadn't dialed in months. Her father answered on the 2nd ring. Claire? Everything okay? Everything's fine, Dad. I wanted to call, tell you about something. She described the conference, the speech, the photograph from Westridge Memorial. Her father listened in the way he always had, silently, absorbing information, waiting until she finished before responding. Your mother would be proud, he said finally. Hell, I'm proud. You found your mission, kid. Not everyone does. It's dangerous work. The best work usually is. But you were trained for danger. Might as well use it for something that matters. They talked for 20 minutes, the longest conversation they'd had since before her first deployment. When Claire finally hung up, she realized she was crying, not from sadness, but from the release of tension she'd been carrying for years. Thomas Green found her there, diplomatically pretending not to notice her wiping her eyes. Good speech, he said. You're a natural at this. I prefer field work. I know, but public visibility serves a purpose. Every healthcare worker who heard you today just learned that accountability is possible. That's worth an afternoon of discomfort. He handed her a tablet. Speaking of field work, we have 3 new cases requesting your involvement. Major hospital in Texas, rural clinic network in Oregon, and a teaching hospital in Pennsylvania. All 3 have red flags suggesting systematic abuse. Your choice which one you take first. Claire scrolled through the case summaries, her trained eye catching the patterns. Complaints that disappeared, witnesses who recanted under pressure, revenue-generating physicians operating without oversight. The Texas hospital, she said. The pattern there looks most like early-stage Westridge Memorial. If we intervene now, we might prevent it from reaching Brennan's level. Agreed. You start in 2 weeks. But Claire, take some time off first. You've been operating continuously for 6 months. Even federal investigators get vacation days. She almost argued, almost insisted she was fine to keep working. But exhaustion had been building beneath the surface. The cumulative weight of 6 different investigations, 6 different hospitals, 6 different groups of terrified workers who'd needed her to be stronger than their abusers. 1 week, she conceded. Then I'm back in the field. Claire spent that week in a cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, 3 hours from the nearest hospital, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. She hiked during the days, swam in the cold creek, read books that had nothing to do with healthcare or law enforcement. At night, she sat on the porch and watched stars emerge in skies unmarred by city lights. On the 4th day, her personal phone rang. The number was blocked, but something made her answer. Ms. Donovan? The voice was formal, careful. This is Warden Robert Matthews from the Federal Correctional Facility where Marcus Brennan is incarcerated. I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Brennan suffered a severe stroke 3 days ago. He's currently hospitalized under guard. Claire's grip tightened on the phone. What's his prognosis? Significant neurological damage. The doctors say he'll likely survive, but with permanent impairment, limited mobility, speech difficulties requiring long-term care. I'm notifying you because prison regulations require us to inform victims when significant health events affect their perpetrators. Is he still a threat? In his current condition? No. Even when he recovers enough to return to the prison population, the stroke has effectively diminished him. I thought you'd want to know. After the call ended, Claire sat on the porch for a long time, processing the information. She'd spent months watching Brennan through the legal system, the appeals, the threats, the desperate attempts to overturn his conviction. She'd prepared herself for years of his hatred, decades of him plotting revenge from his cell. Now that threat had ended, not through legal proceedings, but through the simple biological reality of a 60-year-old man's cardiovascular system failing under stress. She felt no satisfaction, no vindication, just a hollow sense that justice rarely provided the clean narrative closure people imagined. Brennan wouldn't serve his full sentence now. He'd spend whatever years remained to him in a medical facility, diminished and dependent, a shadow of the powerful man who'd terrorized Westridge Memorial. Claire called Amanda with the news. How do you feel about it? Amanda asked. I don't know. I wanted him to face full consequences, to understand completely what he'd done. A stroke doesn't teach lessons. Maybe not. But Claire, the consequences weren't just about punishing Brennan. They were about showing every other abusive administrator that they're not untouchable. That message got delivered loud and clear. Brennan's health doesn't change that. I suppose. Besides, Amanda continued, your work isn't about him anymore. He's a footnote now. You're the story, the investigator who's changing how healthcare institutions handle abuse. That legacy matters more than what happens to one broken man in a prison hospital. The week ended too quickly. Claire returned to civilization, to briefings and case files in preparation for the Texas assignment. She reviewed documentation of the Houston hospital where a chief of surgery reportedly threw instruments, berated staff, and retaliated against anyone who questioned his clinical decisions. The pattern was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. She was scheduled to start as a surgical float nurse in 3 days when Michelle Park called with unexpected news. The federal case against Westridge Memorial Hospital just settled, Park said. The institution agreed to $23 million in fines, mandatory reforms, and 5 years of federal oversight. More importantly, the board has agreed to create a national best practices guide for preventing and addressing workplace abuse in healthcare settings. They're actually implementing systemic change with federal enforcement. If they fail to comply, the entire hospital loses Medicare funding. That's not just Westridge Memorial. That's a precedent for every healthcare institution in the country. Your case, Claire, just changed national policy. Claire sat down slowly, absorbing the magnitude. One nurse defending herself in a hospital corridor had cascaded into federal oversight, national policy changes, and a framework that could protect millions of healthcare workers. There's more, Park continued. Congress is considering legislation, the Healthcare Worker Protection Act. It would create mandatory federal reporting requirements for workplace assault, establish protection for whistleblowers, and fund investigations of institutional abuse. Several legislators specifically cited your case as the catalyst for the bill. Will it pass? Hard to say, but it's being debated, which means your work is forcing conversations that weren't happening before. That's significant. That evening, Claire received an email from Dr. James Reeves, the ER physician Brennan had destroyed 6 years earlier. She hadn't heard from him since the trial. Ms. Donovan, I wanted you to know that I've been offered a position at a major hospital in Seattle. After the Brennan trial, when the truth about the fabricated malpractice case became public, my reputation was restored. Multiple institutions reached out, apologizing for believing Brennan's lies, offering positions to make amends. I start next month as an emergency department director. I never thought I'd work in medicine again. Thank you for giving me that future back. Claire read the email 3 times, then saved it in a folder she'd created for moments when the work felt overwhelming and the opposition insurmountable. The folder held dozens of similar messages now, from nurses who'd found the courage to report abuse, from physicians who'd challenged unethical colleagues, from administrators who'd chosen accountability over institutional protection. Each message represented a life changed, a career saved, a system forced to bend toward justice. The Houston assignment proceeded smoothly. Claire documented the chief of surgery's behavior over 6 weeks, gathered testimony from 17 different staff members, and provided federal investigators with evidence sufficient for both criminal charges and medical license revocation. The surgeon resigned before formal charges were filed, accepting a settlement that barred him from practicing medicine. No dramatic confrontation, no assault attempt, just methodical documentation and inevitable consequences. That became the pattern over the following year. Claire moved through hospitals like a ghost, observing, documenting, building cases that federal prosecutors used to dismantle abusive power structures. Some investigations ended with convictions, others ended with resignation, settlements, policy changes. The specific outcomes varied, but the underlying message remained constant. Healthcare workers deserved safe environments, and institutional power couldn't protect abusers indefinitely. 18 months after the Brennan conviction, Claire received an invitation to testify before a Senate committee considering the Healthcare Worker Protection Act. She sat at a table facing senators, cameras recording every word, and described what she'd witnessed across 23 different medical facilities. "The pattern is consistent," she told the committee. "Powerful individuals abuse staff, institutions protect those individuals because they generate revenue or prestige, victims stay silent because reporting leads to retaliation, and the cycle continues until someone with sufficient resources forces accountability. The current system only works when extraordinary circumstances align, when a victim has federal connections, when documentation is overwhelming, when media attention is sustained. That's not a system. That's luck." Senator Maria Gonzalez, the bill's primary sponsor, leaned forward. "Ms. Donovan, you've investigated 23 facilities in 18 months. How many of those investigations would have been possible without federal backing?" "None. In every case, the institution had internal reporting mechanisms that failed. Staff had tried using those mechanisms and been punished for it. Federal intervention was necessary because local systems were designed to protect institutions, not workers. And if this legislation passes, if we create mandatory federal reporting and whistleblower protection, then maybe victims won't need extraordinary circumstances to get justice. Maybe they'll just need to file a report and trust the system to actually function." The legislation passed 4 months later, signed into law with Claire present at the ceremony. The president mentioned her by name in his remarks, calling her an example of how one person's courage can transform broken systems. Claire accepted the recognition with the same calm demeanor she'd shown throughout the journey, but privately she knew the truth. She wasn't an exceptional hero. She was just someone who'd refused to accept that abuse was inevitable, who'd had the training to defend herself and the connections to ensure consequences followed. The real heroes were the thousands of healthcare workers who spoke up without federal backing, who filed reports knowing they might lose their jobs, who chose truth over safety because patients and colleagues deserved better. 2 years after the Westridge Memorial incident, Claire received a letter forwarded through DOJ channels. The return address was the federal medical facility where Marcus Brennan was serving his sentence. She almost didn't open it. Brennan had nothing to say that she needed to hear. But curiosity won, and she carefully unsealed the envelope. The handwriting was shaky, evidence of the neurological damage from his stroke. The message was brief. "Ms. Donovan, I will never apologize for my actions, as I still believe my leadership was necessary for hospital excellence, but I acknowledge that my methods were flawed. The stroke has given me time to reflect, though that reflection changes nothing about my conviction or sentence. I write only to say this: you were stronger than I anticipated. I underestimated you because I underestimated how many people were willing to speak once someone showed them it was possible. That was my failure. I hope you understand that I did not act from malice, but from conviction that strong leadership requires absolute authority. History will judge whether that conviction was correct." Claire read the letter once, then fed it through a shredder. Brennan still didn't understand. still couldn't grasp that strong leadership and absolute authority were antithetical, that real strength came from accountability, not impunity. She wouldn't waste time trying to educate him. He was irrelevant now, a cautionary tale rather than an active threat. The work continued. More hospitals, more investigations, more cases that ended with convictions or resignations or systemic reforms. Claire became known in healthcare circles. Some revered her, others feared her. Most simply acknowledged that her presence meant change was coming. She trained other investigators, sharing the techniques she'd developed for documenting abuse, building witness trust, and navigating institutional resistance. A dozen federal investigators were now deployed across the country, using her methods to expose toxic leadership in medical facilities. 3 years after the Brennan trial, Claire was offered a permanent position as Director of Healthcare Institutional Oversight for the Department of Justice. She would oversee a team of 20 investigators, coordinate with state medical boards, and develop national standards for workplace safety in medical settings. She accepted the position but requested one condition. She would continue field investigations personally, not just manage from an office. The work was too important to become purely administrative. "You've earned the right to step back," Thomas Green told her when she explained her decision. "You could direct operations without putting yourself at risk." Risk is part of the work. If I'm not willing to do it myself, I can't ask others to do it. On a crisp October morning, 4 years after she'd first walked into Westridge Memorial Hospital, Claire returned to Riverside Falls for a ceremony she'd tried to decline. The city was dedicating a healthcare worker safety center in her name, funded by settlement money from the Brennan case. The center would provide legal resources, documentation training, and support services for healthcare workers experiencing workplace abuse. Patricia Huang met her at the entrance, older now, but carrying herself with a confidence that had been absent during the Brennan years. "You came," Patricia said, embracing her. "I almost didn't. This feels excessive." "It's not excessive. It's necessary. Do you know how many people have contacted this center in the 3 months since we opened? 247. Healthcare workers from across the region, all dealing with toxic workplaces, all looking for help. You created that resource, Claire." The dedication ceremony drew hundreds. Former Westridge Memorial staff, federal investigators, legislators who'd supported the Healthcare Worker Protection Act, and victims from the various hospitals Claire had investigated. Speaker after speaker described how her work had changed their lives, their institutions, their profession. When Claire finally took the podium, she spoke for exactly 4 minutes. "I didn't set out to become the face of healthcare worker protection. I just wanted to do my job without being assaulted by my boss. The fact that such a basic expectation required federal intervention, multiple investigations, and national legislation tells you everything you need to know about how broken our systems were. We're past tense. Because while they're not perfect now, they're better. Victims have resources. Whistleblowers have protection. Abusive leaders face real consequences. That's not my achievement. That's all of yours. Every person who filed a report, who testified despite fear, who chose accountability over comfort. You changed healthcare culture. I just had the privilege of being part of that change." After the ceremony, Jennifer approached with her 2 children, both teenagers now. "They wanted to meet you," Jennifer said. "I've told them about what you did, how you stood up to Brennan, how that gave me courage to speak up too." Claire shook hands with both kids, feeling awkward with their obvious admiration. "Your mom's the brave one," Claire told them. "She testified knowing there might be consequences. That's real courage." As evening fell, Claire walked through Westridge Memorial Hospital one final time. The building felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the accumulated fear of Brennan's reign had finally dissipated. She passed the ER where the confrontation had occurred, the corridor where he'd tried to strike her, the nurses' station where terrified staff had watched their CEO fall. Dr. Margaret Chen found her there. "Reflecting?" Chen asked. "Remembering. This is where it started, not just my work, but the larger movement. Everything that came after traces back to one night in this corridor. Do you ever regret it? The threats, the scrutiny, the constant danger of the work you do?" Claire considered the question honestly. "No, I regret that it was necessary. I regret that systems were so broken one person defending themselves became revolutionary, but the work itself? No regrets. What's next for you? There's a hospital system in Michigan showing concerning patterns, and another in Arizona, and probably a dozen more that haven't crossed our radar yet. The work doesn't end, Dr. Chen. It just evolves. That night, Claire drove out of Riverside Falls for the last time, watching the city lights disappear in her rearview mirror. She'd arrived there 4 years earlier as a nurse with a cover story, operating in shadows, hoping to document enough abuse to justify federal intervention. She left as the Director of Healthcare Institutional Oversight for the Department of Justice, leading a national program that had investigated 93 medical facilities, secured 42 convictions, and changed policy across the entire healthcare industry. Marcus Brennan had wanted to destroy her for daring to challenge his authority. Instead, he'd created the catalyst for his own obsolescence. 6 months later, Claire stood in a small hospital in rural Michigan, watching as the chief medical officer, who'd been abusing staff for 15 years, was escorted from the building in handcuffs. The staff gathered in the lobby applauded, not for her, but for themselves, for finding the courage to report, to testify, to refuse silence. A young nurse approached her afterward, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," the nurse whispered. "Thank you for showing us this was possible." Claire took her hands, looked her in the eyes, and said what she'd said 100 times before but never stopped meaning. "You did this. You spoke up. You refused to accept abuse as normal. I just made sure people listened. The courage was always yours." As Claire drove away from that hospital, her phone buzzed with a message from the DOJ. 3 new cases, all flagged as urgent, all showing patterns consistent with systematic abuse. She reviewed the files at a red light, already planning her approach, already thinking about which identity she'd adopt, which hospital she'd infiltrate first. The work never ended. But that was fine, because somewhere in America, a healthcare worker was being threatened by an abusive superior. Somewhere, a nurse was being told to stay quiet or lose their job. Somewhere, a victim was deciding whether to speak up or survive through silence. And now, when they made that choice, when they found the courage to report abuse despite the risk, they knew something that previous generations hadn't known. The system might actually listen. Consequences might actually follow. Justice might actually be possible. Claire Donovan hadn't set out to change healthcare culture. She'd just refused to be hit by her boss, and then refused to pretend it was acceptable. Everything else had followed from that simple act of self-defense. And across the country, in hospitals large and small, healthcare workers were learning the lesson Brennan had tried so desperately to suppress. Power isn't absolute. Abuse isn't inevitable. And sometimes, when you stand up to a tyrant, you don't stand alone. The quiet nurse with calm gray eyes merged onto the highway, heading toward the next broken system, the next abusive leader, the next group of victims who'd become witnesses, who'd become survivors. She didn't know their names yet, didn't know their stories. But she would. And when she did, she'd make sure those stories ended differently than they had before. Because that was her mission now. Not just seeking justice for individual victims, but transforming the systems that created victims in the first place. Marcus Brennan had built an empire on fear. Claire Donovan had torn it down with documentation, courage, and an unwavering belief that healthcare workers deserved better. And she was just getting started. The end.